storm had been relentless the night Sir Alistair was found dead. Rain hammered against the tall windows of Greystone Manor, wind whistling through the gables, carrying with it a chill that seemed almost tangible, as if the house itself mourned its master. Inside, the library glowed with a warm flicker of candlelight, but the warmth felt hollow. Sir Alistair's body had been discovered in the centre of the room, slumped over his mahogany desk, an open ledger before him, and a small, delicate envelope clutched in his hand. At first glance it seemed simple enough, a man struck down in his own study, but the more one looked, the stranger it became. Chief Inspector Browning had called it unfathomable when he made the first report. The windows had been locked from the inside, the door had no sign of forced entry, and there were no footprints leading to or from the library aside from those of the household staff. The only sound that might have accompanied the crime was the crash of the storm itself. The inspector frowned at the ledger, scanning the columns of figures with a meticulous eye, yet none offered any clue to motive or method. Nothing had been stolen, nothing had been moved, and yet Sir Alistair was dead, his life extinguished in a room that was otherwise untouched. What perplexed Browning most was the envelope in the dead man's hand. It bore no address, no name, only a single line of ink that read, "For the eyes that will see beyond." It was neither a will nor a note of farewell. The writing was neat, deliberate, but oddly archaic, as if it belonged to another time. There were no fingerprints, except Alistair's own, pressed faintly into the paper. The paper itself was a curiosity, thin, cream-coloured, and yet it held the faintest trace of perfume. Not the kind that one would expect in a study, but floral, old-fashioned, like the scent of rosewater. Browning rubbed his temples. Every detail suggested some deliberate puzzle, as if the crime itself were designed to confuse. When Miss Marple arrived, she did so quietly, without ceremony. She had been summoned by a distant cousin of Sir Alistair, who had long admired her skill for seeing what others overlooked. The small, wiry woman moved with the careful precision of someone who measured every step against the possibility of danger or deceit. She did not speak at first, merely observed. The library was her first study. She let her gaze travel over the room, noting the position of the desk, the angle of the chair, the subtle smudges on the polished floor. There was no disorder, no sign of struggle, yet she could feel the tension in the air, as though it clung to the corners of the room like cobwebs. "Locked from the inside," Browning said, as if stating the obvious. "No other way in or out." Miss Marple nodded, glancing toward the windows. "Yes, and yet someone came in. One always does, Inspector. Even when it seems impossible, there is a way." The detective's eyes narrowed. "A ghost, perhaps?" Browning's tone was dry, but Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. "Not a ghost, dear. Just a person who understands the house better than you think." She moved to the desk, gently lifting the envelope. The perfume lingered in her fingers. "And someone who wanted to make sure their message was noticed. There is something deliberate here, but it is meant to mislead. You have to remember, those who commit crimes often do so with pride in their cleverness, yet they leave the smallest clues for those who know where to look." She opened the ledger carefully. Numbers and entries filled the pages, some crossing dates, some annotated with faint initials. Miss Marple's eyes flicked over them, but she ignored the obvious calculations, searching instead for patterns that did not belong. Slight irregularities in the ink, impressions pressed into the page, tiny smudges where a hand may have hesitated. And there it was, a subtle indentation on the margin of the page, forming a shape almost invisible, but there nonetheless. She traced it lightly with her fingertip, a small, precise drawing of a dagger. Browning frowned. "A warning? Or a signature?" Miss Marple said softly. "Someone who wants to be remembered for the act itself." Her gaze moved to the room once more. There was a painting above the fireplace, an old portrait of Lady Greystone, Sir Alistair's late wife, and the candlelight cast a flickering shadow across her stern face. Miss Marple noted how the shadow seemed almost to animate the features, lending them a sly, knowing quality. Something about that gaze felt intentional, as if the placement of the portrait was part of the riddle. She examined the envelope again. "The scent," she murmured, "is not random." Someone deliberately left this, hoping it would mislead us. Most people would think of a visitor or a lady of the house, but in truth, it is more precise than that. We must consider who had access and who had reason to want Sir Alistair silenced, or at least to look as though he was part of a puzzle he could not solve. The household staff were questioned one by one, their testimonies polite but vague, each offering nothing but partial glimpses of the evening's events. The cook had heard nothing over the storm. The housemaid had been cleaning the upstairs corridors. The butler had been in the wine cellar and saw nothing suspicious. And yet Miss Marple felt the tension in their words, the subtle hesitations, the little slips of eye contact that betrayed concealment. Something more than fear lingered in the air. It was resentment, measured and careful, directed towards someone who had wielded power for far too long. She returned to the windows, examining the locks. Each one was secure, no signs of tampering. Then she noticed the hinges, aged metal, prone to slight warping in the damp weather. With delicate fingers she pressed, shifted and tested. One hinge gave just enough to allow the sash to be lifted silently from the outside if someone knew the precise method. Not impossible, just unlikely, unless practiced. And there it is, she whispered to herself. The simplest details hide the truth while the obvious misleads. Always the obvious misleads. Browning watched her curiously, still baffled by the seeming paradox of the crime. "Do you believe this was someone from the household?" he asked. "I do," Miss Marple replied, her voice quiet but certain. "And yet, not entirely. There is an element of revenge here, something long planned. I think it involves someone who knows the manor intimately, but has also waited patiently for the right moment. The dagger on the ledger, the perfume on the envelope, they are signals, messages to a very specific person, or perhaps to the man himself, intended to let him feel the coming threat before it struck." She returned to the desk and touched the envelope once more. He was proud, perhaps arrogant. He believed no one could touch him. And yet, someone did, in the most elegant, untraceable manner. The storm helped, but it was not essential. This crime was designed to look unsolvable, to confuse the eye and the mind, but it is not unsolvable. It merely requires attention to the details that everyone else dismisses. The night stretched on, the storm unabated, but Miss Marple did not move from the library. She considered the house, the servants, the evidence, and the seemingly insignificant traces left behind. Somewhere in those small, deliberate marks lay the key, not only to the murder, but to the person who orchestrated it, with the precision of a chess player 3 moves ahead. As dawn crept over Greystone Manor, illuminating the drenched gardens and the stone facade, Miss Marple finally spoke. "This is no ordinary crime, Inspector. It is a story of revenge long in the making, masked by the elegance of the house and the chaos of the storm. But if we follow the threads carefully, the perpetrator will reveal themselves, and when they do, it will be as much about the mind behind the act as the act itself." Browning nodded slowly, though he still felt the weight of confusion pressing down. Yet, in the careful, deliberate movements of Miss Marple, there was an unmistakable certainty. The crime had begun as an enigma, a locked-room impossibility, but somewhere in the delicate touches, the perfume, the dagger impression, the precise placement of shadows, was the truth waiting to be uncovered. And Miss Marple would see it, as always, with the quiet, penetrating clarity of a mind tuned to the subtleties others overlooked. The unsolvable crime, it seemed, was only unsolvable until someone knew where to look. And Miss Marple, as always, knew exactly where to start. The morning after the storm brought an eerie calm over Greystone Manor. The heavy clouds had parted just enough to allow a pale, watery sun to shine through, casting long, tentative shadows across the stone floors. Outside, the gardens were sodden, petals flattened by the rain, leaves bent and slick with moisture. But inside, the tension of the previous night clung to every corner. Servants moved quietly, their whispers barely disturbing the still air, and the household had an almost ritualized sense of waiting, as if they too anticipated what the day might bring. Miss Marple walked slowly through the hallways, her sharp eyes taking in details the official investigation had overlooked. The slight scuff on the stair rail, the faint oil smudge on the brass door handle, the displaced vase in the drawing-room that had been subtly shifted during the frantic movements of the night. Chief Inspector Browning had begun the formal inquiry, questioning the staff once again, cataloguing each minor observation with bureaucratic precision. He worked diligently, yet there was a certain rigidity to his approach that left him blind to the nuances Miss Marple immediately recognised. The inspector was thorough in the official sense, marking time with statements and reports, yet he seemed unaware of the significance hidden in the mundane, the telling in the trivial. While he focused on alibis and timings, Miss Marple's attention turned naturally to what the house itself had to say. It was in the servants' quarters that she first noticed it. A pair of gloves, finely stitched, damp from the storm, placed neatly atop the back of a chair. They were unremarkable at first glance, but she paused, lifting them gently. They bore no dirt, no evidence of wear, except for the faintest smudge of ink along the cuff. Someone had handled papers, someone who knew exactly where to place their hands to avoid leaving fingerprints. Yet the ink stain suggested a moment of carelessness, a single lapse that betrayed purpose or haste. She tucked the gloves into a small cloth bag, aware that they might be meaningless, or the single clue that would unravel the mystery entirely. Browning noticed her attention and furrowed his brow. "A servant's glove?" he asked, trying to suppress impatience. "I don't see its relevance." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Relevance is often hidden in what seems irrelevant. Notice the ink, the care with which it was placed. People rarely act without intention, Inspector, even when they think no one is watching." Her gaze drifted toward the grand staircase as she heard the faint sound of hurried footsteps above. She followed, moving quietly, noting the polished floors, the way the candle sconces had been adjusted, and the faint trace of a floral scent, reminiscent of the envelope from the library. It was subtle but distinct, almost imperceptible unless one was attuned to it, and she was. At the top of the stairs she encountered the housemaid, Miss Hargrove, who appeared flustered and avoided direct eye contact. "Good morning, Miss Hargrove," Miss Marple said, her voice soft, almost conversational. "You were upstairs last night?" "Yes, ma'am," the maid replied, her tone clipped, almost offensive. "I was tidying. I didn't hear anything, I swear." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Not even footsteps?" Miss Hargrove hesitated, glancing toward the corridor before returning her gaze. I thought I heard someone moving near the library, but it was probably the storm." Miss Marple smiled faintly, as though humouring a child, but inwardly she noted the hesitation, the subtle curl of worry that betrayed uncertainty. The housemaid's reaction was far too guarded, too deliberate to be mere coincidence. A nervous servant might conceal their own mistakes, but this felt deeper, as though she were aware of something significant. Miss Marple filed the observation, knowing that patience would draw out the truth. She descended again, making her way to the library. Browning was there, already discussing procedural matters with the forensic team. "The prints are inconclusive," he said, gesturing to the table. "No forced entry, no weapon, nothing. It's as though he simply expired." Miss Marple knelt beside the desk, examining the ledger once more, her fingers lightly tracing the indentation of the dagger she had discovered the night before. She noted how the marks aligned perfectly with the edge of the desk, as though the page had been pressed intentionally, a coded gesture meant for someone who could interpret it. Her eyes scanned the surrounding floor for any overlooked traces, any residue that might betray the presence of a visitor. A faint, almost imperceptible smear of wax near the fireplace caught her attention, likely from a candle that had been moved or relit hurriedly. She moved closer to the portrait of Lady Greystone above the mantel, tilting her head to study the subtle details. The frame bore a scratch along its lower edge, almost invisible unless one searched for it. A careful touch revealed it was a recent, suggesting the painting had been moved or adjusted. Her mind turned over the possibilities. The envelope with the perfume, the dagger impression, the gloves with the ink smudge, the tiny wax mark, and now the displaced portrait. Each detail, when isolated, might appear trivial, but in conjunction they hinted at deliberate orchestration. Someone had manipulated the scene to confuse, to create a story of impossibility, and yet their pride betrayed them in the smallest errors. As she surveyed the room, her attention was drawn to a slight irregularity in the hearth tiles, a mark that suggested a recent movement of the rug in front of the fireplace. Lifting the edge, she discovered a small folded piece of paper tucked beneath, barely visible. She opened it delicately, careful not to disturb any potential traces. The note was brief, written in a flowing, almost antiquated hand. "Not all is as it seems." Look beyond the obvious. Browning leaned over her shoulder, peering at the note. "Another clue?" he asked. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "Yes, Inspector, but a clue intended to mislead as much as to reveal. It confirms my suspicion that this crime is about more than death. It is a message. Someone is announcing their cleverness, daring anyone to understand. And yet, they have been sloppy. Every message leaves a trace, whether in haste or pride." Her eyes swept the room once more, noting a subtle shift in the light. From the half-burned candles, a faint impression of a chair slightly ajar from its usual alignment, and the faint odour of floral perfume lingering near the open window. All these, she realised, were part of the same pattern. Small, deliberate inconsistencies meant to draw attention in the wrong direction, to distract from the true source. Miss Marple turned her gaze toward Browning, who appeared both impressed and frustrated. "You see, Inspector," she said gently, "while the formal investigation follows routine, it is the subtleties that speak the loudest. A glove, a smear of ink, a shifted portrait, a trace of scent. All of these are clues hidden in plain sight. Someone underestimated what can be observed when one pays attention to the smallest details. And from this, we can begin to understand both the method and the mind behind the crime." Browning rubbed his chin, uncertain. "And the perpetrator?" Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the empty chair at the library desk, on the intricate details she had gathered, and on the servants whose reactions seemed rehearsed yet incomplete. "They are among us," she said softly, "but they are patient. They wait, watch, and act with precision. The day may be young, but the first strands of their deception are already unravelling, if we know where to look." As the sun climbed higher, illuminating the mansion's damp interiors, the investigation began to shift subtly. Routine procedures continued, but in the hands of Miss Marple the case took on a new shape, a puzzle that was beginning to form edges, revealing that every object, every gesture, and every hesitation had its place in the larger design. And though the full picture remained obscured, the first hints of truth glimmered through the careful observations of a detective whose keen eye missed nothing, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. She placed the note back on the desk and allowed herself a moment to breathe, thinking of the clever mind that had orchestrated this elaborate deception. The game had begun, and Miss Marple knew that to win, she would need patience, precision, and a readiness to see what others refused to notice. The widow's revenge, as it seemed, was subtle, refined, and frighteningly meticulous, and it was only just beginning. The day had grown warmer, yet an uneasy tension lingered in Greystone Manor, a palpable residue of the night's grim events. Miss Marple remained in the library, though she moved between rooms with careful purpose, her keen mind mapping the house, its inhabitants, and the subtle interplay of observations she had collected. By late morning, Chief Inspector Browning had summoned the household staff for formal questioning, each witness arriving in a quiet procession, their faces lined with nerves, their hands twitching with uncertainty or restraint. Miss Marple watched, noting not only what was said, but how it was said, the hesitations, the glances, the unconscious gestures that betrayed inner truths. First came the butler, Mr. Ellsworth, a tall, austere man, whose voice held the precise cadence of someone trained in discipline and discretion. He recounted the night with meticulous detail, yet his eyes flickered toward the windows whenever he mentioned the storm, as though he wished to emphasize the impossibility of intrusion. "I was in the wine cellar all evening," he said, straightening his back. "I saw no one enter the library, nor did I hear anything beyond the storm. The candles in the hall were all extinguished by 10 o'clock. Miss Marple's eyes followed the movement of his hands, the way he clenched and unclenched them on his lap. "You claim you heard nothing," she said softly, "but you also note the storm's noise. Tell me, Mr. Ellsworth, were there moments when the wind's gusts were unusually loud?" Ellsworth blinked, caught off guard. "Yes, perhaps, but—" "Then there were gaps," she said gently. moments when something else could have moved unnoticed. She let the comment hang in the air, allowing the implication to settle. Ellsworth shifted uncomfortably, but he said no more. Next came the housemaid, Miss Hargrove, who had seemed particularly flustered the previous morning. She repeated her account, claiming she had been cleaning upstairs and heard nothing, insisting the storm drowned out all other sounds. Yet Miss Marple detected the tremor in her voice, the brief, involuntary glance toward the library, as if she expected something, or someone, to be hidden behind the shadows. "You were upstairs," Miss Marple said, "and yet the scent of floral perfume lingers throughout the house. Tell me, Miss Hargrove, does anyone here wear such a fragrance?" The girl hesitated, her lips pressed together, then shook her head. "No, ma'am. Only the lady of the house, perhaps, long ago." "Long ago?" Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "And yet the scent is recent, fresh even, not faded with time." Miss Hargrove avoided her gaze. I don't know, ma'am." Miss Marple let the statement rest without pressing further, filing it away for later consideration. The cook, Mrs. Whitby, arrived next, a stout woman with a careful, motherly manner. She recounted the evening with an emphasis on practical details, the timing of dinner, the preparation of meals, the storm outside, but there were subtle inconsistencies. She claimed the butler had been in the cellar at 10 o'clock, yet earlier. She had mentioned seeing him in the hallway while delivering soup. When Miss Marple repeated the timing, the cook hesitated, correcting herself slightly, though the correction seemed reluctant, almost rehearsed. "And what of Sir Alistair himself?" Miss Marple asked. "Did he seem troubled that evening?" Mrs. Whitby wrinkled her brow. "No, not troubled, ma'am, though he did appear distracted. He glanced often at his ledger, muttering to himself, but nothing alarming. Distracted, perhaps, but the ledger itself held subtle traces of pressure, and Miss Marple had already discovered the dagger-shaped impression. Something in the accounts had made him anxious, yet whether from financial strain, personal matters, or a warning from someone close, she did not yet know. The gardener, a quiet man named Jameson, was summoned last. He had little to add, claiming to have been tending the greenhouse during the storm, yet his hands bore small traces of damp soil, suggesting he had been outdoors later than he admitted. When questioned about the house, he smiled faintly and claimed ignorance, though Miss Marple detected a flicker of amusement in his eyes, almost as if he found the investigation trivial. Throughout the questioning, contradictions emerged like tiny sparks in dry wood. Times did not align perfectly, positions conflicted subtly, and each witness offered statements that seemed plausible on the surface but grew more tangled under scrutiny. Some were too eager to cooperate, offering details unprompted, perhaps hoping that excessive candour would mask hidden guilt. Others were guarded, careful with words, yet betrayed themselves in micro-expressions, the slight narrowing of eyes, the delicate bite of a lip, the subtle shift of weight from one foot to another. Miss Marple's mind catalogued it all, connecting inconsistencies like threads on a loom. She noted how the butler's insistence on the storm's loudness might conceal a gap when someone moved unseen. She considered the maid's avoidance, the cook's reluctant correction, the gardener's concealed amusement. Each fragment seemed minor in isolation, but together they formed a pattern of deliberate obfuscation. Someone was shaping the narrative, constructing a story to mislead those who observed only the surface. She returned to the library and examined the envelope again. The floral scent lingered faintly, persistent yet elusive. Inhaling lightly, she mused. These contradictions are like the perfume, present but fleeting, revealing themselves only if one approaches with attention. She thought of the gloves with the ink smudge, the note tucked beneath the rug, the displaced portrait, the wax mark near the fireplace, all tiny signals left either by the murderer's hand or by the storm of human anxiety that followed. Browning entered, looking frustrated. They've all been questioned. There's nothing tangible. Every statement seems to cancel another, and yet no one admits to seeing or hearing anything that could explain the death. It's like the house itself swallowed the truth. Miss Marple allowed a faint, knowing smile. Not swallowed, Inspector, merely hidden beneath layers of human behaviour. When people lie, whether from fear, loyalty, or self-interest, They leave traces. It is not the story they tell that matters most, but the gaps between the words. She leaned closer to the ledger, her eyes scanning the entries once more. The subtle dagger impression caught her attention anew, its shadow sharp in the early afternoon light. The details, the ledger, the envelope, the gloves, the slight inconsistencies in witness accounts were all part of a carefully orchestrated plan. The murderer had considered every angle, had attempted to control the narrative completely, yet in their pride they had overlooked the most telling elements: the minute human reactions, the unconscious admissions, the tiny deviations from routine. Her gaze lifted to the fireplace, to the slight disarray of the rug, to the displaced portrait, and finally to the open window where the floral scent had lingered longest. A theory began to crystallize. Someone with intimate knowledge of the house had exploited its features, the storm and the occupants themselves, to craft a scene of apparent impossibility. And someone among the household was either complicit or fearful, perhaps both. Miss Marple called Browning closer. "Observe the contradictions carefully, Inspector. Some are deliberate, others accidental. Between them lies a map to the truth. A keen eye sees not only what is present, but what is absent, and in these absences we will find our answer." Browning followed her gaze, still sceptical, yet he could not deny the subtle coherence Miss Marple traced through the chaos. The investigation had begun to shift, moving beyond the mere cataloguing of statements and into the domain of interpretation, where perception and intuition worked alongside evidence. Every statement, every gesture, every hesitation was a piece of a larger puzzle. The voices of deception had begun to speak, and Miss Marple listened with patience, understanding that the tangled web of half-truths and misdirections was slowly untangling itself, revealing hints of the mind that orchestrated the entire affair. By evening, the staff had departed from formal questioning, leaving the manor quiet except for the occasional creak of settling timbers. Miss Marple remained in the library, her thoughts alive with the subtle interplay of evidence and human behaviour. She considered each witness, their contradictions, their eagerness or reticence, and the invisible lines connecting them to the crime. Somewhere in the hesitations, in the overly precise statements, and in the carefully avoided truths, the murderer's intentions were taking shape, and Miss Marple, as always, would see them clearly when the time was right, piecing together not just what had occurred, but why and who had orchestrated it with such cunning subtlety. The following morning, a thin mist hung over the Greystone estate, curling around the gables and seeping through the gardens like a ghost of the storm still clinging to the land. Inside the house, the tension of the previous day had not dissipated. If anything, it had thickened. Miss Marple sat quietly in the library, her sharp eyes scanning the same ledger that had first hinted at the subtle dagger impression, the envelope with its delicate perfume, and the small, folded note tucked beneath the rug. Yet now she sought something more elusive, not merely the how of Sir Alistair's death, but the why, the tangled web of human desires that had shaped the scene. Each of the household staff had provided accounts, carefully constructed and sometimes contradictory. And now, as she reviewed the statements, Miss Marple began to sense the invisible threads that tied each individual to motives of varying complexity. There was not a single explanation, not a simple grievance or moment of opportunism. The motives formed a labyrinth, twisting and interlacing, each thread suggesting a different reason for someone to wish Sir Alistair harm. She began with Mr. Ellsworth, the butler, whose precision and discipline concealed a quiet pride. Miss Marple recalled the subtle shifts of his eyes when discussing the storm and his own movements. Ellsworth had served the family for decades, yet he had been passed over repeatedly for promotions within the household hierarchy. Was it resentment, perhaps a slow-brewing envy of his master's authority, that could have driven him to strike or at least manipulate the scene to ensure a message was left? A glance at the ledger suggested no financial irregularities in Ellsworth's favour, but motives are not always measured in pounds and shillings. Sometimes they are measured in small indignities accumulated over years, in slights unnoticed by all but the one who endured them. Miss Marple's thoughts then turned to Miss Hargrove, the flustered housemaid whose hesitation and subtle avoidance had suggested knowledge beyond the ordinary. The girl's modest salary and limited prospects contrasted sharply with her perceptiveness, and Miss Marple considered how jealousy or fear could twist an otherwise obedient servant into complicity or secrecy. Perhaps she had witnessed something she should not have, or perhaps her loyalty to another had overpowered her sense of duty to truth. Her reactions indicated both caution and calculation, and Miss Marple filed it mentally as a potential piece of the intricate puzzle. Mrs. Whitby, the cook, had been the most outwardly cooperative, but the reluctant correction in her statements about the butler's movements hinted at concealed truths. Perhaps it was fear rather than malice, fear of being implicated in something she did not fully understand. Or perhaps it was the faintest trace of resentment toward a man who controlled not only the household but the fortunes of everyone within it. Greed, subtle and understated, could manifest as protectionism, as the careful manipulation of facts to shield oneself while avoiding the attention of authority. The gardener, Jameson, seemed the most detached, yet Miss Marple's observation of his quiet amusement suggested a man who enjoyed watching the machinery of intrigue unfold. Was it merely entertainment, or was there a deeper reason for his apparent indifference? Perhaps he had his own grievances, unspoken slights, or even a secret loyalty that placed him in a unique position to influence events without detection. Miss Marple set out her mental map of the household, each individual with access, each with motive, each with opportunity. The more she considered them, the more tangled the web became. It was not sufficient to assign blame to a single thread. Rather, the entire network of human interactions suggested multiple overlapping reasons for Sir Alistair's demise. Perhaps greed intersected with jealousy, revenge intertwined with fear, and pride threaded itself through all. The puzzle was not a single line, but a dense lattice of possibility. She returned to the ledger and examined it anew, focusing on names, initials, and annotations that had previously seemed incidental. She noticed how some entries bore subtle corrections, small deletions, or annotations in the margin, notes that might have indicated financial disputes or secret dealings. Could someone have felt threatened by exposure? The dagger-shaped impression seemed less a threat than a statement, a reminder of control, yet it also spoke to pride. The murderer wanting the act to be noticed, recognized for its elegance and precision. Miss Marple pondered the envelope with the floral scent again. It was a signal, yes, but for whom? Was it meant to taunt Sir Alistair, to signal a message of revenge, or was it intended to mislead the household, placing suspicion on those least likely to be guilty? Each scent, each placement of objects, and each tiny deviation from ordinary order could reflect a motive as much as an opportunity. Someone who was meticulous would take great care in orchestrating such details, and yet every human mind is vulnerable to pride, impatience, and error. She moved through the manor, mentally revisiting the statements, and the contradictions came into sharper focus. The butler had insisted on his presence in the cellar while the cook described him elsewhere. The maid had denied hearing anything, yet the floral scent suggested proximity to the library. The gardener's hands bore traces of soil that conflicted with his account. Each small discrepancy could be explained away, but Miss Marple understood that it was the accumulation of these inconsistencies that revealed intention. People rarely lie perfectly. They leave fragments, evidence of their thoughts and desires. Her mind then turned to the possibility of external motives. Was there someone beyond the household with cause to harm Sir Alistair? The ledger suggested that financial matters were stable, yet there could be relationships, friendships, or grudges hidden beneath the surface. Miss Marple recalled that subtle note tucked beneath the rug. Not all is as it seems. Look beyond the obvious. Whoever left it intended for someone to question what they believed to be certain, to consider motives that lay hidden beneath the apparent simplicity of the crime. As the afternoon light shifted, she began tracing connections between the household members. Ellsworth's quiet pride intersected with the cook's subtle resentment. The maid's fear overlapped with the gardener's amusement. The ledger provided potential financial grievances, the note hinted at personal vendettas, and the dagger impression suggested a symbolic message. Motives were layered, intertwined, impossible to isolate neatly. Yet, in the tangle of possibilities, Miss Marple began to see patterns emerging, indications of relationships that had previously gone unnoticed, alliances, unspoken agreements, and perhaps even deliberate misdirection, designed to ensure no single suspect could appear entirely culpable. She paused by the fireplace, recalling the wax smear and the slight displacement of the rug. The careful positioning of the portrait above it had forced her attention toward the shadows, guiding the observer to perceive the scene in a particular way. The murderer had been mindful not just of opportunity but of perception, considering not only the act itself but the narrative that would unfold afterward. It was a crime that combined intellect, artistry, and human emotion, a reflection of a mind attuned to both pride and malice. Miss Marple returned to the ledger, examining the sequence of entries, the initials scrawled with varying pressure, the minor corrections in the handwriting. She considered how these intersected with human motives: fear of exposure, envy of position, resentment over slights, or the desire for revenge long delayed. She thought of Lady Greystone, the late wife whose presence seemed to linger in the portrait, and considered whether her memory could have influenced hidden tensions among the living, stirring feelings of guilt, longing, or revenge. By evening, Miss Marple had begun to categorize the motives, constructing a latticework of possibility that accounted for each suspect's potential desires and fears. None could be entirely ruled out, and no single theory explained the crime completely. Yet in the weaving together of these threads, a picture began to emerge, one that suggested a careful orchestration of human emotion and opportunity. Greed, jealousy, fear, and pride intersected like overlapping shadows, and only by understanding the interplay between them could the mystery be unravelled. She walked slowly through the main hall, observing the subtle traces left behind, the faint perfume in the air, the slight misalignment of furniture, the marks on the hearth. Each was a fragment of a larger story, pieces of a labyrinthine motive that demanded patience and careful thought. Miss Marple understood that to confront the crime, one had to see not only the act but the minds that had shaped it, and the delicate lattice of intentions, resentments, and ambitions that had guided each step. Sitting once more in the library, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of reflection. The maze of motives was complex, almost suffocating in its density, yet each thread offered a clue, each contradiction a hint. Patience, observation, and the quiet discernment of human nature would gradually reveal which of these threads led to the heart of the crime, and which were mere distractions. The murder of Sir Alistair was not only a question of opportunity, method, or force. It was a mirror of the tangled, hidden desires that bound the household together. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, fingers lightly resting on the ledger. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the interwoven motives settle in her mind, forming a map not of evidence alone, but of human intent. She understood that the resolution of the crime would require not only attention to fact, but insight into character, the fears, ambitions, and resentments that compelled someone to turn opportunity into action. And in that understanding, she felt the first faint threads of clarity begin to form in the labyrinth of deception surrounding Greystone Manor. The following day brought with it a brittle sort of clarity. The storm had passed entirely, leaving a sunless, pale sky above Greystone Manor, and the household moved with a sense of tentative relief. Chief Inspector Browning, buoyed by a sudden breakthrough, appeared almost triumphant as he called a meeting in the library. The staff had gathered, nervously whispering among themselves, for they too were caught in the shifting tide of suspicion. A single discovery, a seemingly decisive clue, had drawn attention, and Browning intended to announce it to the household. "I believe," Browning began, holding a small folded piece of paper in his hand, "that we have found the key to this mystery." His tone was self-satisfied, and he glanced expectantly at Miss Marple, who observed him with quiet patience. The paper he held bore the careful handwriting of one of the household members, Miss Hargrove. It was a note, partially hidden among the pages of a ledger she had reportedly tidied during the stormy night. It contained a cryptic message: "He will see what he should not." Silence is the answer, which Browning interpreted as evidence of guilt, assuming that the maid had plotted or participated in the crime. The household gasped, some in shock, others in disbelief. Miss Hargrove's face turned pale, her hands trembling as she denied knowledge of the note's origin. Browning waved her protest aside, confident that the discovery proved his theory. "It is clear," he declared, "that Miss Hargrove's proximity to the library and her handling of the ledger implicates her in Sir Alistair's death. She had both motive and opportunity." A ripple of tension spread through the room. Miss Hargrove's denials became more desperate, yet Browning's insistence seemed absolute. He moved to question her further, but Miss Marple remained silent, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. She understood Browning's reasoning. Superficially, the note appeared damning, but intuition whispered that the apparent evidence was a trap, a lure to mislead and hasten closure, rather than reveal the truth. Once the initial drama subsided, Miss Marple requested a private conversation with Browning. "Inspector," she said gently, "be cautious in declaring a conclusion. The note may appear incriminating, but the true significance lies not in its content alone, but in the context in which it was found. Consider who might benefit from directing suspicion toward Miss Hargrove." Browning frowned, a flicker of doubt crossing his features, though he brushed it aside. "The evidence is clear. The girl had access. The handwriting matches her style, and she was near the ledger that night. It all points to her." Miss Marple shook her head. "Or it points to someone clever enough to manipulate perception, to plant a false trail while the real culprit remains unseen. There is a pattern here, Inspector, and it is one designed to appear solved before it truly is." Despite her warning, Browning proceeded with his plan. He formally confronted Miss Hargrove, who trembled beneath his gaze, asserting repeatedly that she had no knowledge of the note. To most, her protests seemed feeble, an indication of guilt. To Miss Marple, they were consistent with someone ensnared in a web not of their making. She watched the girl's expressions, the nervous fidgets, the involuntary glances, noting the subtle truth hidden within fear rather than malice. As the day progressed, the inspector's confidence only increased. He announced a preliminary resolution of the case, praising the detective work that had apparently led to the arrest of the guilty party. The household was shaken but relieved that the nightmare might be over. Even the cook and the gardener, whose motives and actions had remained opaque, seemed to accept the conclusion, grateful for a resolution they could comprehend. The sense of finality, however, did not extend to Miss Marple, whose mind remained alert, scrutinizing the edges of the evidence and the inconsistencies in human behavior that still lingered. She returned to the library, examining the ledger and the note once more. Something about the note's placement bothered her. It had been folded and tucked with a precision that suggested intent beyond mere concealment. The handwriting, though superficially similar to Miss Hargrove's, bore subtle differences, tiny flourishes and inconsistencies in pressure that betrayed a practiced imitation rather than genuine writing. Miss Marple's fingers traced the paper lightly, noting the faint imprint of another hand, older, steadier, more confident than the young maid's. The realization stirred a quiet unease. Browning's solution had overlooked this nuance, accepting the surface without probing the depths. Her suspicions deepened as she considered motive. Miss Hargrove had shown fear and avoidance, but no sign of malice, no evidence of planning or capability. Whoever had left the note understood how to exploit human nature, to engineer a scene of accusation that would appear convincing even to trained investigators. It was not the first clue that mattered. It was the deliberate misdirection woven into the narrative itself. Miss Marple's thoughts then returned to the other members of the household. The butler, disciplined and meticulous. The cook, restrained but observant. The gardener, detached yet amused. Each had opportunity and reason to act, yet none had been implicated in Browning's early conclusion. Could one of them have orchestrated this, taking advantage of Miss Hargrove's proximity and fear to fabricate guilt? The possibility seemed increasingly plausible. The afternoon passed with a tense quiet, punctuated only by the soft rustle of papers and the occasional footstep in the corridor. Miss Marple moved deliberately among the rooms, examining shadows, scents, and displacements with a practiced eye. She noticed the faint traces of floral perfume lingering near the window where the note had been discovered, a detail Browning had not considered significant. It suggested a deliberate placement, a guiding of perception, and perhaps a taunt from the real perpetrator. Someone was still in control of the narrative, remaining hidden while the authorities embraced a convenient conclusion. By early evening, the household had settled into an uneasy routine. Miss Hargrove had been temporarily relieved of duties, not formally accused, but effectively isolated. Browning patrolled the library and the hallways with the satisfaction of one who believed the case was closed. Yet Miss Marple's intuition told her otherwise. She lingered near the hearth, tracing with her eyes the faint wax smear, the displacement of the rug, the slight shift in the portrait's alignment. Each of these minor details spoke not of a solved case, but of a staged scene, designed to mislead and create the illusion of resolution. Her mind returned to the note itself, to the careful folding and precise placement. Whoever had planted it possessed intimate knowledge of the household, of the staff, and of the investigative process. They understood human psychology, using fear and expectation to their advantage. Miss Marple considered how pride might influence the perpetrator, the need to craft an elegant, seemingly unsolvable puzzle while remaining entirely hidden. The more she examined, the clearer it became that Browning's breakthrough was a triumph of superficial observation rather than true understanding. She walked slowly toward the open window, inhaling the lingering scent of perfume, the subtle signature of someone who had moved deliberately through the house. Whoever they were, they had chosen their moment carefully, striking in a manner that left almost no trace. The false victory of the authorities was not the end of the investigation. It was a prelude to something more, a pause before the next move in a game that only Miss Marple fully appreciated. Night fell, and the manor quieted beneath the shadow of anticipation. Miss Marple remained in the library, her attention unbroken, cataloguing every minor detail, every discrepancy, every hesitation that might hint at the real criminal. Browning, confident in his success, retired to his quarters, unaware that his apparent solution had been carefully engineered to mislead. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, knowing smile. The puzzle was far from complete. The real culprit remained in the shadows, patient, deliberate, biding their time while the world celebrated a resolution that was not true. And in the quiet observation of a single, unassuming detective, the strands of deception were already beginning to unravel, promising a confrontation that would reveal not only the act itself, but the mind that orchestrated it with cunning subtlety. The night deepened, and Greystone Manor settled into uneasy silence. Somewhere within the walls the real criminal moved unseen, confident that the authorities had been misled, unaware that Miss Marple had already begun to see the truth hidden beneath the layers of fear, pride, and deceit. The false victory was nothing more than a pause in a carefully choreographed game, and the real reckoning was yet to come. Miss Marple sat in the quiet of the library long after the household had retreated to their rooms, the faint glow of the fireplace casting trembling shadows along the walls. The false resolution announced by Chief Inspector Browning lingered like a bad taste, one that she could not ignore. The notes, the gloves, the ledger, the floral perfume, all the elements seemed deliberate, staged, yet she sensed a deeper current hidden beneath the surface, a thread that connected not only the immediate players, but something older, long buried in the manor's history. Her thoughts returned to the portrait of Lady Greystone above the fireplace. She had admired it countless times as a child visiting the estate, though memory had blurred her recollection. Something about the way the frame had been shifted, the scratch along the lower edge, and the slight displacement of the rug beneath it, suggested that someone was guiding perception towards specific details while concealing others. The act itself, subtle and precise, hinted at knowledge not only of the present but of the house's past, of its hidden nooks and the secrets they had sheltered for decades. Miss Marple rose and moved to the secretary desk. In the corner, rifling carefully through drawers that had once belonged to Lady Greystone, she had a sense that overlooked correspondence or old records might illuminate motives now invisible. Among the dust-laden ledgers and brittle envelopes, she discovered a small forgotten notebook belonging to the late Lady Greystone herself. Its edges were frayed, its pages yellowed, yet the writing remained clear and deliberate. As she read, a pattern began to emerge. Lady Greystone had been aware of tensions within her household long before Sir Alistair's death. Disputes over inheritance, grievances over perceived slights, and, most importantly, an incident dating back decades involving a distant relative, a secret financial transaction, and a quietly hushed scandal. The names of the butler, the cook, and even Miss Hargrove appeared in marginal notes, not as wrongdoers, but as individuals touched by that old grievance, each carrying fragments of memory, loyalty, or resentment that had shaped their current behaviours. It became clear that Sir Alistair's death was not merely a consequence of immediate circumstance. It was the culmination of long-standing tensions and unresolved resentments that had been allowed to fester. The old case, a forgotten dispute over trust, finances, and family honour, was the seed from which the present tragedy had grown. Miss Marple considered how each of the household staff, bound by years of shared experience and private knowledge, had been subtly influenced by the echoes of that past. Their motives were layered, not only with immediate fear or envy, but with memories and loyalties extending back decades. Her thoughts returned to the gloves, still preserved carefully in her small bag. The ink smudge suggested recent use, but the choice of placement, the careful folding, and the subtle misdirection were actions shaped by someone who understood both the household and its history. Miss Marple realized that whoever orchestrated the scene had studied the past as meticulously as they had manipulated the present, exploiting old resentments to ensure that the current events followed a pattern that appeared logical on the surface but concealed the true hand behind them. She retraced the timeline of the household staff in her mind, examining the subtle intersections of past and present. The butler, Mr. Ellsworth, had been involved decades ago in managing the late Lady Greystone's estate. He had witnessed disagreements over inheritance that left him quietly resentful, yet loyal to the family name. Mrs. Whitby, the cook, had been employed at the manor for nearly 40 years, privy to secrets and confidences that would never be discussed openly, and Jameson, the gardener, though more recent in his position, had been connected through distant kinship to those involved in the old scandal. Even Miss Hargrove, the timid maid, was not entirely unconnected. Her family had served the estate for generations, and she had grown up hearing half-remembered stories that shaped her perception of the household hierarchy and expectations. Miss Marple considered how these historical threads could intersect with the current crime. The murderer had not acted solely out of immediate grievance or personal gain. They had exploited the collective memory, the shared history, and the unspoken loyalties of the household. Every small detail, the floral perfume, the misaligned rug, the displaced portrait, the dagger impression in the ledger, was calculated to mislead by referencing what the household knew and remembered. The note planted to implicate Miss Hargrove, the hurried corrections in the cook's statements, the butler's meticulous precision, all were shadows cast not merely by the present act but by the ghosts of the past. Miss Marple felt a chill as the realization settled in. The crime was not isolated. It was part of a continuum, a story that had begun long before Sir Alistair's death, and which the true perpetrator now sought to conclude according to their own design. Whoever had orchestrated it understood not only the dynamics of the present household, but also the hidden allegiances, loyalties, and grudges that stretched back decades. The murder was a culmination, the final act in a drama scripted over many years, and to resolve it, she would have to understand both the history and the present simultaneously. She returned to the ledger, examining names, dates, and annotations with fresh eyes. It was not just the financial entries that mattered, but the subtle patterns, the careful, almost imperceptible corrections, the odd choice of phrasing, the occasional marginal note that seemed insignificant but hinted at influence and manipulation. In these details, Miss Marple saw the fingerprints of someone who had studied the household, tracing lines of connection and calculating the impact of each individual's history, knowledge, and susceptibility. Even the floral scent seemed to gain new significance. Miss Marple recalled letters in the old notebook describing Lady Greystone's personal preferences, her choice of fragrances, and the way she used scent to communicate subtly with household members. It was a language of memory, and the murderer had exploited it to suggest a narrative, to guide perception in a way that would appear natural to anyone unaware of the hidden context. By late evening, the full scope of the crime began to crystallize in Miss Marple's mind. The murder of Sir Alistair was not merely a matter of opportunity, nor the consequence of a single motive. It was the orchestrated result of decades of hidden tensions, intersecting loyalties, and concealed knowledge. The murderer had understood the past, exploited it in the present, and carefully manipulated events to create the illusion of resolution that Browning had so hastily embraced. Miss Marple moved quietly through the corridors of the manor, noting the faint impressions left behind, subtle shifts in furniture, traces of a carefully placed object, the lingering scent in the air. Each was a fragment of a larger pattern, one that required an understanding of history as well as the immediate circumstances. The crime was layered, complex, and almost elegant in its manipulation, and only by tracing the connections between past and present could the truth be revealed. She paused before the portrait once more, studying the subtle lines of Lady Greystone's expression. The way her painted gaze seemed to linger on the room below. It was a reminder that history, memory, and loyalty often outlive their immediate actors, shaping the lives and actions of those who remain. The murderer had relied upon these lingering influences, understanding that the shadows of the past could be manipulated to cloak the present. Miss Marple returned to the library, cataloguing her observations, cross-referencing the ledger, the notebook, and the behaviours of each suspect. The realization was clear. Any attempt to resolve the crime without considering the historical context would be incomplete. The solution required insight, not only into opportunity and motive, but also into the intricate interplay of memory, influence, and long-standing human dynamics. As night deepened, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The past was never truly gone, she thought, especially in a household steeped in tradition, loyalty, and unspoken grievances. To solve the murder of Sir Alistair, she would have to unravel the complex tapestry of history that bound the suspects together, revealing not only the immediate actions, but the long-buried impulses that had guided them. The shadows of the past were now unmistakably present, and Miss Marple knew that only by following their subtle guidance could the true criminal finally be brought into the light. Miss Marple awoke before dawn, the first pale light of morning spilling through the curtains of her temporary room at Greystone Manor. The manor was quiet now, almost eerily so, the hush of the night settling into the corners of the house as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Yet within that silence she could feel the pulse of hidden truths waiting to be coaxed into the open. She had spent days examining evidence, retracing statements, and studying the tangled motives of those under suspicion, but the breakthrough she needed had not yet arrived. Today, she would employ a tactic she rarely relied upon: subtle psychological probing, using observation and suggestion to provoke unconscious reactions that might reveal what words alone could not. She began with a simple exercise, designed to appear casual, even conversational, but carefully engineered to elicit the smallest crack in a practiced facade. First, she visited the library, where the household staff had been gathering each morning for tasks or breakfast. She chose the butler, Mr. Ellsworth, to observe, knowing that a man of discipline and pride often masked his feelings in the rigid posture of propriety, yet that the slightest suggestion could unbalance even the most composed demeanour. "Mr. Ellsworth," she began gently, "I have been reflecting on the ledger, and the many entries it contains. It is a curious thing, isn't it? How small errors or small alterations can change the meaning of a record entirely." Ellsworth's hands, usually so steady, twitched minutely. He straightened his back, clearing his throat. "I suppose so, Miss Marple. Ledgers are precise things. Even the smallest discrepancy could cause confusion." Miss Marple leaned slightly closer, smiling softly. "Yes, and it must be frustrating to observe such discrepancies, especially when one knows who is responsible for them. It must feel irritating to be aware and yet unable to correct what is hidden." For a fraction of a second, Ellsworth's eyes flickered toward the ledger lying on the side table. Then he gave a tight nod and murmured, "Yes, frustrating." The emphasis, the micro-expression, told her something more than mere irritation. It hinted at familiarity with manipulation, with careful orchestration of details, and perhaps even pride in managing a situation so delicately controlled. Satisfied that the butler's reaction had revealed subtle tension, Miss Marple moved on to another approach, employing an unusual, almost theatrical test of character that she had long observed as effective in eliciting truthful responses. She requested that all members of the household write a brief account of the events of the stormy night, without prompting or supervision, framing it as a method to clarify the sequence of events for her own understanding. The task seemed mundane, but in asking for independent documentation, she knew the psychological pressure would encourage slips, hesitations, or overcompensation. The writing commenced in the library, each individual occupying a quiet corner, pen scratching against paper. Miss Hargrove's hand trembled as she wrote, though she seemed sincere. Mrs. Whitby scowled slightly at the task, muttering to herself, careful with every word. Jameson, the gardener, reclined with an almost casual air, his writing slow, deliberate, almost playful in its precision. It was Ellsworth who revealed the most subtle yet telling discrepancy. While composing his account, he unconsciously included a detail no one else could have known: the faint floral perfume near the ledger, noting it almost parenthetically, as though recalling a minor irritation rather than a central element of the night. The inclusion, while seemingly insignificant, betrayed an awareness of the note's placement, and more importantly, suggested deliberate manipulation. He had observed and remembered more than he had admitted, and the slight defensiveness in his posture as he wrote betrayed an effort to control the narrative while protecting something, or someone. Miss Marple watched him carefully, her gaze calm and unintrusive, noting how his eyes darted toward her occasionally, seeking approval or reassurance. That small unconscious reaction, the flicker of attention, and the imperceptible tightening of the jaw, spoke volumes. The meticulous butler had been orchestrating his account, carefully curating which elements of the night were included and which were omitted, yet the act of writing forced a minor inconsistency into the open. Satisfied with the first observation, she turned her attention to the cook, Mrs. Whitby. Knowing the woman's pride in her work and her tendency toward caution, Miss Marple introduced a seemingly innocuous question: the method of candle lighting and extinguishing on the night of the storm. Mrs. Whitby described her actions in detail, emphasizing timing and sequence. Miss Marple pressed gently, and if someone had altered the usual order, perhaps to mislead or create an impression, would you have noticed? Mrs. Whitby paused, pen hovering above the paper. A shadow of hesitation crossed her face. I suppose I might have noticed, yes, she admitted, though her voice was uncertain. The simple suggestion, intended to provoke consideration, had caused her to betray the faintest awareness of interference, hinting that someone in the house had exploited routines and habits to create the illusion of impossibility. Miss Marple's final test was reserved for the gardener, Jameson, whose casual demeanour suggested indifference, but whose eyes betrayed sharp observation. She engaged him in conversation about the storm, deliberately introducing a slight discrepancy in the timing of events. "You mentioned tending the greenhouse," she said. "But what about the hour when the wind shifted and the rain was heaviest? Surely someone would have been inside the house at that moment." Jameson's casual air faltered. He hesitated, a faint twitch at the corner of his mouth, and then laughed lightly, perhaps to mask the discomfort. "Well, one might think so," he said, carefully neutral in tone. Yet the micro-expression, the brief narrowing of his eyes, revealed more than his words, hinting at amusement at the household's assumption and perhaps knowledge of the careful orchestration behind the apparent chaos. Miss Marple noted the subtle interplay of humour and concealment, understanding that Jameson had been privy to something he found intellectually entertaining, rather than dangerous or threatening to himself. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had gathered a collection of these small yet revealing cues. Each observation, minor in isolation, began to form a pattern. Subtle awareness of misdirection, faint signs of overcompensation, an unconscious disclosure of knowledge beyond what had been admitted. The act of writing, the careful questioning, and the strategic introduction of minor contradictions had encouraged these small cracks to appear in the facades of those under suspicion. It was in these cracks, Miss Marple realized, that the true path forward lay. The unusual tactics, psychological probing, observation of involuntary behavior, and structured yet innocuous tasks had revealed not just discrepancies in statements, but the hidden dynamics of knowledge, pride, and manipulation. Ellsworth's attention to detail, the cook's fleeting hesitation, Jameson's subtle amusement, All suggested awareness of an orchestrated narrative designed to mislead, and all pointed to an individual capable of exploiting both history and habit to conceal the truth. As dusk settled over Greystone Manor, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations. The unconventional methods had succeeded in exposing subtle vulnerabilities in the suspect's deceptions. While no single piece of evidence could yet definitively reveal the murderer, the reactions had narrowed the field, highlighting who was not merely participating in the household, but manipulating perception itself. The real criminal remained in the shadows, patient and cunning, yet Miss Marple now had a clearer sense of their mind and methodology. They were aware of the investigation, carefully watching and directing the flow of suspicion, confident that outward appearances would suffice to mislead. But even the most meticulous planning could not conceal human nature entirely. Unconscious reactions, carefully observed, betrayed intentions that words alone could obscure. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, fingers resting lightly on the ledger, her mind tracing the delicate lattice of observations. The psychological experiment, though subtle, had yielded a glimpse of the mind behind the crime, revealing both pride and cunning, patience and audacity. She allowed herself a faint smile, knowing that the next steps would be guided not solely by evidence, but by the insight into character these reactions had unveiled. The shadows of deception were beginning to yield to the quiet persistence of observation, and the real criminal, still unseen, would soon find their carefully constructed narrative challenged. The morning air in Greystone Manor was heavy with anticipation. Miss Marple had spent the night reviewing the subtle reactions she had observed, Ellsworth's meticulous over-attention, Mrs. Whitby's fleeting hesitation, and Jameson's barely perceptible amusement. Each small crack in their facades had guided her toward a clearer picture of the intricate orchestration behind Sir Alistair's death. She had planned to cross-reference these insights with the ledger and the notes she had gathered, confident that a breakthrough was imminent. Yet as she entered the library, a shock awaited her that would upend even her careful calculations. The ledger lay on the central table, but it was not as she had left it. Pages had been torn, smudged with ink, and rearranged haphazardly. The delicate folds of the note once tucked beneath the rug were missing entirely, leaving only the faintest traces of floral perfume as a hint that it had ever existed. Someone had deliberately interfered, erasing or altering the material evidence that she had been relying upon. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and unwavering, scanned the room. The chairs were slightly shifted, the hearth embers still warm, as though a visitor had passed through in haste, careful to leave minimal traces. Her heart did not race, not out of fear, but out of recognition. This was the hallmark of the true criminal: awareness, foresight, and a capacity to act before suspicion could solidify. The act was brazen, yet calculated, signalling that the murderer was not only hiding in plain sight, but actively manipulating the investigation, shaping perception with each deliberate move. Whoever had done this understood the importance of timing and the fragility of trust within the household. Miss Marple's thoughts turned first to opportunity. Who had access to the library overnight? Ellsworth, of course, with his proximity and knowledge of the household routines. Mrs. Whitby, whose movements through the corridors were largely unobserved, could have slipped in under the guise of early meal preparation. Jameson, the gardener, although typically outdoors, had shown awareness that suggested familiarity with every corner of the manor, and Miss Hargrove, though nervous and seemingly innocent, had been implicated earlier by the planted note, making her the perfect scapegoat for a clever manipulator. She examined the remaining fragments of the ledger carefully. The torn edges and smudged ink suggested haste, but also intention. The missing information was not destroyed by accident. Certain pages had been selectively removed, hinting that the perpetrator knew which details might reveal the underlying orchestration. Miss Marple's mind raced, considering what could be gained from this act. It was a bold attempt to bury the truth, to force the investigation back into confusion, to manipulate the authorities into accepting a premature resolution once more. With deliberate calm, she began retracing movements from the previous night. She observed small inconsistencies in the staff's accounts anew, noticing gestures, eye movements, and subtle hesitations that seemed almost rehearsed. Ellsworth's over-attention to detail suddenly appeared less a virtue than a carefully cultivated shield. Mrs. Whitby's explanations carried just enough plausibility to distract, while Jameson's casual amusement hinted at foreknowledge rather than genuine indifference. The removal of the evidence, when combined with these behavioral cues, painted a vivid portrait. Someone within the household was actively working to mislead, to redirect suspicion, and to protect themselves. Miss Marple understood that this act of vanishing evidence was more than a simple obstruction. It was a challenge, a test of perception and patience. The murderer was confident that the authorities, eager for resolution, would accept the chaos as proof of complexity, rather than deliberate deception. Browning, already prone to premature conclusions, would likely see the torn ledger as confirmation of confusion rather than a signal of cunning. This was exactly the leverage the criminals sought, to manipulate not just the investigation, but the investigators themselves. She moved to inspect the desk where the ledger had been kept. Faint smudges in the dust suggested that someone had handled the book with gloved hands, careful to avoid leaving fingerprints. The position of the chair and the slight indentation in the rug indicated a hurried approach, a movement designed to retrieve only specific pages. Miss Marple noted a nearly imperceptible floral scent lingering in the corner, echoing the note that had vanished, subtle evidence of presence, a signature of the orchestrator's calculated interference. Her next step was to observe the household with heightened scrutiny, noting interactions that previously seemed trivial. Ellsworth's movements were precise, almost rehearsed. He lingered too long over routine tasks as if to establish an alibi. Mrs. Whitby watched the other staff with careful detachment, her eyes flickering towards spaces she had no reason to check. Jameson's casual demeanour carried a hidden alertness, as though each glance and smile were calculated to convey innocence while hiding awareness. Even Miss Hargrove, nervously fidgeting in her corner, displayed subtle signs of tension when discussing tasks she should have known intimately. Miss Marple realized that the vanishing evidence had done more than create confusion. It had revealed the criminals' audacity, their meticulous attention to timing, and their understanding of human psychology. By forcing the household and authorities to react to the loss, the murderer had inadvertently exposed their own confidence, their assumption that misdirection alone would suffice. And in that exposure, Miss Marple found the smallest but most crucial thread to follow. She decided to turn the situation to her advantage, employing the same subtle psychological tactics she had used earlier. By planting hints that suggested continued observation, she could provoke the real criminal into revealing more of themselves. A deliberately misplaced candlestick, a ledger placed just slightly off-centre, a whisper of observation to a staff member. These were all methods to unsettle the orchestrator and elicit inadvertent clues. Miss Marple understood that someone accustomed to precision might falter under the suggestion that their careful control was being monitored. Throughout the day, she watched closely, noting every shift in demeanour, every micro-expression, and every hesitant word. Ellsworth occasionally cast glances toward the empty space where the ledger had been, a flicker of worry betraying his usual composure. Mrs. Whitby's hands moved nervously when discussing mundane tasks, betraying the strain of oversight. Jameson's eyes, usually playful, held a sharper, calculating focus, as though testing the limits of what he could manipulate without detection. Even Miss Hargrove seemed to sense a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, her fear mingled with relief at the attention turning elsewhere. Miss Marple reflected on the stakes. The theft or alteration of evidence had escalated the situation from an intellectual puzzle into a dangerous interplay of strategy, deception, and risk. Trust within the household had become fragile, each member aware that the actions of others could shift perception and implication at any moment. And yet, within this precarious balance, the detective herself maintained a composed vantage point, able to perceive the faint signals that revealed not only who could act, but who had acted already. By evening, the tension had grown palpable. The household, sensing that the investigation had been complicated anew, moved with quiet caution. Miss Marple, however, felt the faint thrill of progress. The vanishing evidence had, paradoxically, drawn the criminal's presence closer to the surface. Every hurried glance, every subtle correction, and every micro-expression now carried greater weight. The orchestrator of misdirection, confident that their interference would bury the truth, had instead signalled their audacity, giving Miss Marple the leverage she needed to probe deeper. As she prepared to retire for the night, Miss Marple reviewed the day's observations. The ledger's disappearance, far from halting the investigation, had illuminated the calculated nature of the crime. The true criminal remained unseen, but their actions revealed not only skill but vulnerability. The slightest misstep, the smallest unconscious reaction, could expose them. And Miss Marple, ever patient and observant, knew that the moment for revelation was approaching. Outside, the manor's shadows deepened, curling along the walls and through the gardens, as though the house itself conspired to guard its secrets. Inside, the household moved with unease, unaware that the detective's quiet vigilance was already tracing the invisible threads left by the criminal's daring interference. The vanishing evidence had raised the stakes, fractured trust, and intensified the game, but it had also set the stage for discovery, as long hidden truths prepared to emerge from the shadows. The manor had grown unnervingly quiet by mid-morning, the storm's aftershocks now replaced by an uneasy tension that clung to the corridors. Miss Marple, having spent hours retracing steps and observing the subtle cracks in each suspect's composure, felt that she was on the cusp of insight. Yet the day had barely begun when a sudden commotion shattered the fragile calm. A shrill cry came from the servants' wing, echoing through the halls, and Miss Marple, instinctively alert, hurried toward the sound. She found Jameson, the gardener, slumped across the threshold of the small sitting-room, his face pale and his hands trembling. A small, sharpened letter opener protruded from the side of the chair he had been sitting in, the blade angled in such a way that it seemed almost deliberately theatrical. Blood had pooled beneath him, yet he was conscious, gasping out fragmented sentences. It was deliberate, meant to warn, he stammered, before fainting completely. Miss Marple knelt beside him, steadying him and observing the signs, the precise angle of the attack, the absence of forced entry, and the careful placement of the weapon itself. Whoever had done this had intended not merely to harm, but to signal, a message crafted for clarity only to those who could interpret it. Ellsworth arrived seconds later, alarm evident in his face, followed by Mrs. Whitby and the housemaid. Browning, who had been reviewing the torn ledger in his quarters, burst into the room with the rushed confidence of someone still trying to assert authority. "What is this?" he demanded, aghast, as he took in Jameson's condition. Miss Marple remained calm, though, as she noted the subtle details that Browning had already missed. The letter opener bore no fingerprints. The chair had been positioned deliberately, and the arrangement suggested a performance more than a spontaneous attack. "Inspector," she said quietly, "this is not a random act of violence. The person responsible knows precisely what they are doing. This is a warning, a signal to anyone who might pry too closely into the events surrounding Sir Alistair's death. They are several steps ahead and want us to know it." Browning frowned, his earlier confidence dissipating as Miss Marple's words sank in. "A warning? But who—" Miss Marple gently cut him off. "Not who, Inspector. Observe what has been done. Notice the precision, the care, the calculated placement of each element. It is a demonstration of control. The criminal is not desperate, they are deliberate, and they understand the psychology of this household intimately. They want to remind us, and themselves, that any misstep will be noted and exploited." Jameson was moved carefully to a couch, where Miss Marple continued to examine the scene. The small sitting-room revealed more subtle signs, a faint smudge of ink on the edge of a table, a chair slightly displaced from its usual position, and a shadow of perfume lingering faintly in the air. All were signs that someone had entered and acted with intention, leaving a carefully crafted tableau designed to provoke alarm and hesitation. Miss Marple noted how even the absence of struggle implied calculation. The attacker had expected compliance, or at least passivity, knowing the psychological impact would be significant. While Browning organised an immediate search of the manor and instructed the staff to secure themselves in separate areas, Miss Marple's mind was already racing. She considered the possible implications. If Jameson had been targeted, it was no longer sufficient merely to solve the first crime. The perpetrator was willing to escalate, to strike boldly in the light of day, and to exploit fear, as a tool of manipulation. The game had changed. The stakes were no longer confined to identifying a culprit, but now extended to preventing further harm. Ellsworth, standing rigidly at the doorway, appeared unusually tense, his usual composure faltering as he glanced toward the arrangement of the room. Mrs. Whitby clutched her apron tightly, a faint tremor in her hands, revealing a tension she had managed to conceal before. Miss Hargrove hovered near the hallway, her face pale and anxious, clearly absorbing the tension but also taking in every detail with a sharpness born of fear. Miss Marple noted each of these reactions, understanding that the perpetrator's intent was to observe and manipulate even these subtle responses. The detective turned her attention to the note that had vanished the previous day. Its absence now carried heightened significance. Someone had already interfered once, and now the escalation suggested a continued and adaptive strategy. Whoever orchestrated both the first murder and this attack on Jameson was attuned not only to the physical movements of the household, but also to their psychological states. They understood that fear, hesitation, and misdirection could be as effective as any weapon. Miss Marple decided that direct observation alone would no longer suffice. She needed to provoke another reaction, a subtle reveal that would provide insight into the mind orchestrating these events. She moved deliberately among the staff, casually referencing the ledger, the missing note, and Jameson's attack, observing their expressions, gestures, and vocal inflections. Each micro-reaction was a fragment of information: a narrowed eye, a faint blush, a tightened grip. Ellsworth's composure, already fraying, revealed a micro-expression of almost imperceptible satisfaction when Jameson's attack was discussed in terms that suggested foreknowledge. Mrs. Whitby's fingers twitched, betraying a concern beyond the obvious worry for Jameson's health. Jameson, once stabilized, attempted to describe the attack, but his account was punctuated by hesitations and uncertainty, hinting at partial recognition or prior knowledge of the assailant's tactics. Miss Hargrove, though terrified, seemed acutely aware of the implications, her gaze darting subtly toward Ellsworth and Jameson, as if calculating risk. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had pieced together a pattern that Browning, for all his procedural experience, had not noticed. The criminal was adaptive, opportunistic, and highly intelligent, exploiting both history and psychology. Each act, first the manipulation of evidence, then the attack on Jameson, demonstrated a strategic mind several steps ahead, capable of reading human behavior and predicting reactions. The game was no longer simply to identify guilt, it was to anticipate the next move and prevent further escalation. Recognizing the urgency, Miss Marple arranged for a controlled observation, subtly guiding the staff into situations where minor reactions could be noted without alerting the perpetrator. By introducing small inconsistencies, misplaced objects, casual references to past events, and deliberate pauses in conversation, she sought to draw out recognition, hesitation, or overcompensation that might reveal the criminal's identity. It was a delicate psychological dance, one that required patience and precise attention to detail. The evening brought an uneasy stillness to the manor. Staff moved with caution, conscious that the criminal's presence, though unseen, remained potent. Miss Marple reviewed her observations, noting how each subtle reaction had begun to delineate a chain of influence and knowledge. The perpetrator was clever, confident, and increasingly bold, but even the most meticulous planning could not fully conceal the unconscious reveals of behavior, the micro-expressions that betrayed awareness, pride, or fear. As she prepared for the night, Miss Marple considered the implications of the morning's attack. The second act had clarified a critical truth. The criminal was watching, learning, and anticipating every move. Any misstep could provoke another escalation, and any premature declaration of resolution could be exploited as a distraction. The investigation had evolved into both pursuit and defense. She was no longer merely seeking to identify the murderer, but also to anticipate and prevent their next calculated move. In the stillness of the manor, shadows stretched across the walls, deep and deliberate, as though the house itself conspired to hold its secrets. Miss Marple, however, felt no fear. The unexpected twist, though alarming, had revealed patterns invisible in the calm, and it had provided insights that would guide the next stage of her investigation. The real criminal remained at large, confident in their control, yet every careful observation, every subtle manipulation, and every psychological probe was steadily narrowing the field. The dance of deception was far from over, but Miss Marple, ever patient and keenly observant, now understood the rhythm, and she was ready to follow it to its conclusion. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Greystone Manor, casting long beams across the library floor where Miss Marple had spent hours poring over her notes. The second attack had unsettled the household, yet in the midst of this heightened tension, she felt a sense of clarity forming. Patterns, subtle and elusive, were beginning to reveal themselves in the chaos, like faint threads appearing in a complex tapestry. Every misplacement, every hesitation, every smudge or shadow of scent she had observed over the past days suddenly began to take on a new significance. She reviewed the ledger once more, examining the torn pages and smudged ink. At first glance, the damage seemed random. Mere attempt to confuse the investigation, but on closer inspection, a rhythm emerged. The pages removed and the notes altered were not arbitrary. They corresponded to entries that referenced old debts, inheritance disputes, and minor grievances involving each member of the household. The criminal had deliberately shaped the evidence to suggest confusion and randomness, yet in doing so, they had left the outline of their strategy. Miss Marple's sharp eye caught a detail that had been overlooked by both the authorities and the staff. The missing pages always aligned with moments when someone had been absent or unobserved, providing the murderer with the opportunity to act unimpeded. Her mind drifted back to Jameson's attack. The precision of the letter opener's placement, the absence of struggle, and the faintly lingering perfume all seemed deliberate now, not only a warning but a reinforcement of the pattern. The murderer was methodical, exploiting opportunity and expectation, orchestrating both misdirection and demonstration simultaneously. Every act, no matter how small, was part of a design meant to manipulate perception while revealing just enough to those capable of interpreting the signals. Miss Marple walked slowly through the corridors of the manor, retracing the subtle impressions she had noted. A slightly misaligned chair, a candle set just off-centre, a whisper of scent in the air, a reluctant glance from Ellsworth when a certain subject was mentioned. Each was a piece of the puzzle, a marker placed intentionally by the orchestrator. And then, as she paused near the small sitting room, a realization struck her with the suddenness of a lightning bolt. The key to the entire series of events had been under her nose from the very beginning. It was the floral perfume, a detail everyone had assumed was a simple personal choice, or a faint remnant from the vanished note. Miss Marple considered it carefully, recalling the moments when its presence had coincided with deliberate acts, the placement of the ledger, Jameson's attack, subtle hints during her questioning of the staff. The scent had been used as a signal, a psychological marker, a way for the criminal to guide perception and communicate without words. Each appearance was neither accidental nor ornamental. It was a deliberate tool, a signature connecting the present chaos with the orchestrator's understanding of the household and its history. Miss Marple's mind raced as she connected the dots. Ellsworth, who had displayed subtle signs of pride and meticulousness, had been consistently present when the floral scent was noticed. Mrs. Whitby, hesitant in her reactions, had been nearby when the scent appeared in smaller, almost imperceptible bursts. Jameson's casual amusement, masking recognition, coincided with the scent's use as a signal of control. Even Miss Hargrove, the seemingly timid maid, had been acutely aware of the smell in moments when she might otherwise have been overlooked. The pattern was not merely behavioral, it was sensory, a method of communication and manipulation embedded within the environment itself. She recalled a conversation with Browning the previous evening, when he had dismissed the floral perfume as trivial. "Inspector," she had said, "it is not the perfume itself that matters, but the moments in which it appears, the reactions it provokes, and the awareness it demonstrates. The perpetrator is communicating through subtlety, and every observer has unwittingly become a participant." Browning had frowned, sceptical yet intrigued, and Miss Marple now saw clearly that this minor detail had been the thread connecting all of the chaotic events. Her reflections turned to the psychological strategies she had employed, the unconventional tests of character, The written accounts, the introduction of minor inconsistencies, the casual questions had all been interpreted through the lens of the floral signal. Each small reaction, each unconscious reveal, was amplified or triggered by the presence of the scent, allowing Miss Marple to trace the perpetrator's influence without direct confrontation. The pattern was intricate, yes, but once understood it revealed the hand behind the chaos with startling clarity. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the vanished ledger and the stolen note. Now it was clear that the manipulation of evidence had been carefully orchestrated to highlight the pattern, to emphasize the perpetrator's control, and to distract the authorities from the true method of communication. The act of removing or altering documents was itself a signal. The criminal wanted to provoke investigation, to display their mastery over both information and perception. By misdirecting attention to the ledger's destruction, they had unwittingly emphasized the floral signal as a marker, a psychological thread that connected the orchestrator to each act and each reaction. She moved to the window, watching the garden below where Jameson had been tending the greenhouse earlier. The placement of tools, the alignment of flower pots, and even the subtle care with which he handled plants now took on new meaning. Each small action had been informed by awareness of the floral signal, either consciously or unconsciously, tying the manipulation of the physical environment to the orchestrator's overarching plan. The criminal had mastered both the tangible and intangible elements of the household, using history, habit, and perception as instruments of control. Miss Marple retraced the sequence of events in her mind: the first murder, the vanishing evidence, the attack on Jameson, and the subtle psychological tests she had employed. Each act, once understood in relation to the floral signal, formed a coherent pattern. The criminal had acted in deliberate stages, guiding suspicion, creating fear, and manipulating perception to maintain advantage. The moments that had seemed isolated or random now revealed themselves as deliberate and connected, demonstrating foresight, intelligence, and a profound understanding of human behavior. The realization brought with it a sense of quiet satisfaction. The key had been in plain sight all along, hidden not in the apparent chaos but in the subtle threads linking action to perception. Miss Marple understood that the true challenge now was to use this insight to predict the criminal's next move, to anticipate the ways in which they might continue to manipulate the household, and to expose the orchestration before another act of violence occurred. She turned back to the room, scanning the faces of the staff, noting every glance and gesture. Ellsworth's precise movements, Mrs. Whitby's cautious expressions, Jameson's measured amusement, and Miss Hargrove's nervous attentiveness, all now fit into the emerging pattern, their behaviours informed by the orchestrator's subtle influence. Each reaction was a note in the larger composition, and the floral signal was the key that unlocked the score. Miss Marple felt a renewed sense of purpose. The chaos, once disorienting, had yielded its hidden structure. The pattern emerged not in the grandiose gestures nor in the dramatic events, but in the small, seemingly insignificant details: a scent, a glance, a hesitation. These were the breadcrumbs left deliberately or unconsciously by the criminal, guiding the investigator who knew how to see. And now that pattern had been discerned, Miss Marple knew that she was poised to turn insight into revelation, to trace the threads to their source, and to bring clarity to the complex web of deception that had ensnared Greystone Manor. The detective's mind, alert and patient, traced each connection again, confirming the coherence of the emerging pattern. Every act, every subtle signal, every reaction now made sense within the context of the orchestrator's method. The key to the case had indeed been in plain sight, hidden not in grand evidence but in the intricate, delicate rhythm of perception, psychology, and subtle communication that only the keenest observer could discern. Miss Marple, having pieced together this delicate mosaic, understood that the next steps would not be dictated by luck or intuition alone, but by a careful application of insight, timing, and anticipation. As evening approached, the manor seemed to exhale a quiet, expectant pause. The criminal, confident in their orchestration, remained unseen, but the threads of their manipulation were now visible, a map etched in behaviour, scent, and subtle cues. Miss Marple, with the pattern firmly in mind, prepared to follow it to its conclusion, aware that the final revelation would demand both patience and precision. The game was far from over, yet for the first time the true shape of the danger was clear. Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room, the afternoon sunlight slanting through the tall windows and casting long, warm stripes across the carpet. She had spent the morning revisiting each subtle observation, replaying conversations, gestures, and reactions in her mind. The pattern she had discerned, the floral scent, the carefully timed actions, the micro-expressions, was now fully visible, and she felt certain that the motive was hidden within the same delicate framework. It had never been a question of mere greed or envy. Those would have been obvious, even pedestrian, and the criminal had carefully crafted every act to conceal a far deeper, more personal obsession. Her thoughts returned to the first night, the night of Sir Alistair's death, and to the seemingly trivial details everyone else had overlooked. The ledger, the note, the almost imperceptible rearrangement of furniture, and above all the faint floral perfume. They were all pieces of a puzzle that revealed not just action, but intention and a desire to manipulate perception to the extreme. Miss Marple's intuition told her that the criminal's focus was not wealth or inheritance, though those were used as bait. It was something far more intimate, something rooted in memory, obsession, and long-standing emotional turmoil. She rose and moved to the hearth, gazing into the dying embers as her mind traced the path of manipulation. Ellsworth had displayed meticulous attention to detail, an almost obsessive need to maintain appearances, while Mrs. Whitby had shown fleeting hesitation, a nervous response she had previously misattributed to guilt by association. Jameson, in his quiet amusement, had betrayed an awareness of patterns and control, and Miss Hargrove had demonstrated subtle anxiety and calculation beyond her youthful inexperience. The criminal, Miss Marple realized, had orchestrated these reactions like a conductor directing a symphony, each note revealing, concealing, or redirecting attention. It was during a casual conversation with Browning that a subtle remark triggered the insight. The inspector, frustrated by the slow progress and the stolen evidence, had muttered in passing, "I don't see why someone would go to such lengths, unless the motive is personal." The words, though spoken in irritation, struck a chord with Miss Marple. Personal. That was the thread she had been tracing all along, yet she had not articulated it fully. She had considered opportunity, control, and perception, but personal stakes often leave deeper marks than financial or social incentives. A motive rooted in human attachment, obsession, or long-held resentment could explain both the cunning and the audacity of the acts. Returning to the events of the manor, she considered the floral scent in a new light. Its use was not simply a signal or an embellishment, it was a signature, a manifestation of memory and fixation. Whoever had committed these acts associated the smell with the past, with moments that had shaped their desires and fears. The scent was deliberately chosen, a psychological marker linking the present manipulation to events long buried, events that could only make sense to someone intimately acquainted with Sir Alistair and the household. Miss Marple realized that the crime had been executed not to gain money or power alone, but to assert control over a narrative tied to past emotional wounds. She decided to confront the question directly. She invited each of the household members to the drawing-room, framing the meeting as a discussion of patterns and observations, a review of minor inconsistencies that she claimed might assist in clarifying the sequence of events. Browning, anxious and slightly sceptical, followed, as did Ellsworth, Mrs. Whitby, Jameson, and Miss Hargrove. Miss Marple allowed the conversation to drift, subtly guiding attention towards small, seemingly irrelevant details: the scent in the air, the alignment of objects, the timing of certain actions. She observed reactions with meticulous care, noting micro-expressions and unconscious gestures that revealed underlying emotions. Ellsworth, as always precise, tensed at the mention of the floral scent, his hands tightening slightly on the edge of his chair. His eyes flickered toward the corner where the scent had been most evident, betraying both recognition and subtle shame. Miss Marple pressed gently, noting the careful construction of his responses. "The scent," she murmured, "seems to have a particular resonance, does it not? Almost as if it reminds someone of a memory best kept hidden." Ellsworth's subtle tremor confirmed her suspicion. The crime had been driven not by avarice but by an emotional need, an obsession with control and connection to something lost or unresolved. Mrs. Whitby's response was quieter, but equally telling. When asked about her perception of the unusual occurrences, she hesitated, fingers curling around the hem of her apron. It always felt like someone was watching, guiding us, not to hurt, but to ensure we followed a path set long before any of us arrived, she whispered. The words, almost involuntary, revealed the psychological weight that had been imposed upon the household and suggested that the orchestrator's motive was entwined with history, memory, and a need for validation or vengeance rooted in the past. Jameson, still recovering from the attack, displayed a faint smirk when the discussion turned to the deliberate nature of the assaults. It was amusement, tinged with recognition. He understood the cunning involved and the personal nature of the orchestrator's intent. He had observed, perhaps even admired, the skill and subtlety, but the insight revealed a chilling truth. The criminal's actions were not coldly calculated for profit or fear alone. They were deeply, personally motivated, rooted in a psychological need that demanded both secrecy and theatricality. Miss Hargrove's anxious glances completed the picture. Her reactions, while outwardly hesitant, revealed awareness and complicity, suggesting that she had either been manipulated or had understood the orchestrator's intent in ways that the other staff had not. Her fear and attentiveness were consistent with the presence of a controlling force whose motives extended far beyond conventional crime. They were personal, intimate, and psychologically complex. It was then in the quiet observation of these reactions that Miss Marple understood the full motive. Sir Alistair's death, the manipulation of evidence, and the attacks on household members had been executed as part of a deeply personal obsession. The criminal had felt wronged, isolated, or denied acknowledgement in ways that only they could understand. The actions had been designed not only to exact vengeance or gain advantage, but to assert a psychological dominance, to manipulate perception and memory, and to orchestrate events that mirrored the unresolved tensions of the past. The motive was not greed, envy, or mere revenge. It was a psychological imperative, a compulsive need to control narrative and outcome to reconcile deeply held emotional wounds. Miss Marple articulated this realization carefully. The criminal, she said softly, is driven by a past that refuses to remain buried, by memories and desires that demand recognition and control. The acts we have observed, the first crime, the vanishing evidence, the attack on Jameson, are all expressions of that inner compulsion. They are intended not merely to harm, but to manipulate, to assert a presence, and to control the perception of everyone within this household. The motive is personal, intimate, and deeply psychological, explaining the extreme lengths taken and the meticulous care employed. Ellsworth's sudden pallor confirmed her assessment, as did the subtle reactions of the others. The realization was as destabilizing as it was clarifying. The criminal had been operating from a place of profound emotional intensity, an obsession that explained both the audacity and the precision of their acts. Miss Marple now understood not only the pattern of the crime, but the heart of the orchestrator's intent. As evening fell over Greystone Manor, the detective felt the weight of understanding settle around her. The crime had been constructed as much in the realm of psychology as in the realm of action, and the true motive, personal, obsessive, and deeply rooted in the past, was finally revealed. The next step, she knew, would require careful planning, for the criminal's psychological compulsion meant they could act again if provoked. But Miss Marple, armed with insight into both method and motive, was ready. The orchestrator's mind had been exposed, and the stage was set for the final resolution, guided not by guesswork but by understanding the depths of human obsession that had driven the entire sequence of events. The manor lay in a tense silence as evening deepened into night, shadows stretching long and dark across the corridors. Miss Marple had spent the day meticulously arranging the elements that would bring the orchestrator of chaos into the open. Every observation, every subtle reaction, every misplaced object had been noted, catalogued, and connected. She had reconstructed the psychological landscape of the criminal with precision, and now every piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. The time had come for the final confrontation. She summoned the staff to the drawing room under the pretense of a routine review of household affairs. Browning, ever eager yet slightly hesitant, followed closely, still flustered by the prior attacks and the vanishing evidence. Ellsworth, Mrs. Whitby, Jameson, and Miss Hargrove took their places around the room, each tense and wary, their eyes flickering with suspicion or fear. Miss Marple's demeanour remained composed, calm as a gentle tide, concealing the precise orchestration of the trap she had set. "My dear friends," she began, her voice soft yet firm, "we have witnessed a series of events over the past days that have unsettled everyone in this household. The manipulation of evidence, the attacks, the vanishing of documents, all were intended to confuse and mislead. Yet the pattern has emerged, and the motive has been revealed. Tonight, we shall see the final truth laid bare." Her gaze swept slowly across the assembled group, noting reactions with meticulous attention. The subtle tension in Ellsworth's shoulders betrayed both recognition and apprehension. He shifted slightly, betraying a habitual need to maintain composure under scrutiny. Mrs. Whitby's fingers tightened around the folds of her apron, a nervous tick that indicated inner conflict. Jameson's eyes flickered with anticipation, almost enjoying the unfolding drama, while Miss Hargrove's pale face reflected fear, awareness, and perhaps complicity. Miss Marple's keen eye caught every nuance. Each was a note in the final symphony, and she knew which would strike the correct chord. She continued, "The person responsible for orchestrating these events has acted out of a deep personal compulsion. Their motivation is not mere avarice or envy, but an obsession rooted in long-held emotional wounds, memories, and a need for control. Every act, every subtle misdirection, every attack has been a manifestation of this desire." She allowed the words to settle, observing reactions carefully. Ellsworth's eyes widened, a micro-expression of guilt and recognition that he failed to suppress. Mrs. Whitby's lips pressed tightly, as though biting back a confession or perhaps a nervous denial. Jameson's amusement faltered, and Miss Hargrove's anxious gaze darted toward Ellsworth with unspoken understanding. "Now," Miss Marple said, producing a small vial of perfume, "I believe everyone will recognize the significance of this detail. The floral scent, seemingly insignificant, has appeared repeatedly at moments of orchestration. Its presence is no accident. It is a signature, a psychological marker linking the orchestrator to each act." She allowed the vial to rest in plain view on the mantelpiece. Ellsworth's face drained of colour. A subtle tremor passed through his hand as he reached unconsciously toward the edge of his chair. Mrs. Whitby's eyes flickered toward him, betraying a connection that had been carefully hidden until now. Miss Hargrove shifted slightly, lips parting as if to speak but restraining herself, while Jameson's expression held the briefest glimmer of recognition, quickly masked by a practiced smile. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, voice unwavering. "Ellsworth, the evidence, the attacks, the vanished ledger, all point directly to you. The patterns, the psychological manipulation, the careful control of perception and circumstance, these are hallmarks of your method. Every step has been deliberate, yet every act, subtle or overt, has left traces for those attentive enough to see. Your compulsion has guided these events, but it has also betrayed you." Ellsworth's face twisted, a mixture of shock, anger, and desperation. He rose suddenly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, the movement breaking the fragile tension. "You have no proof. You have only assumptions." His voice shook, betraying the calculated composure he had maintained for days. Miss Marple's eyes, however, remained calm, unwavering, as she observed the psychological cracks widening under the pressure. "The proof is not only in what you have done, but in how you have acted," she said softly. "Every hesitation, every subtle signal, every carefully timed manipulation has formed a pattern. You sought to control perception, to conceal your motive, yet your own actions have revealed the truth." She gestured toward the vial, the subtle scent lingering in the air as a reminder, almost a silent accusation. Ellsworth's face contorted a desperate attempt to regain control. "This is madness. You cannot pin this on me. His voice faltered as his eyes scanned the room, realizing that every gaze was now aware, every observer attuned to his subtle reactions. He moved toward the window as if to escape, but the doors were closed and Browning stepped forward, blocking any path. Panic edged his voice. "I didn't mean—" "Stop," Miss Marple said firmly. Her voice carried a weight that silenced him immediately. "There is no escape in denial, no refuge in deflection. The orchestrator has been revealed not through accusation alone, but through observation, through understanding the interplay of human behavior, memory, and compulsion. The truth is here, and it cannot be concealed." Ellsworth's shoulders slumped. The carefully constructed facade of composure shattered under the concentrated observation, the cumulative weight of psychological insight pressing down. His breathing grew shallow, eyes darting nervously, aware that every gesture betrayed intent and recognition. Miss Marple remained composed, patiently allowing the realization to take hold. Finally, with a broken sigh, he slumped into the chair, defeated. "It was necessary," he murmured, voice barely above a whisper. "I had to control everything, to prove—" His words trailed off, the depth of obsession, compulsion, and unresolved grievance now evident. The crime had not been about money, power, or even revenge. It had been about asserting a personal narrative, reclaiming control over memories and events that had haunted him for years. The lengths he had gone to, the meticulous planning, the psychological manipulation, all were driven by this inner compulsion, the need to orchestrate reality itself. Miss Marple nodded quietly. "Yes, Ellsworth. It was the need to assert control, to orchestrate events according to your vision. But every act, every effort to manipulate has also left traces. The floral signature, the pattern of interactions, the deliberate misdirection, all of it has revealed the truth to those who observe carefully. Justice is not only about evidence but understanding, and now the hidden motive, long buried and carefully concealed, has been exposed." Browning moved forward to take Ellsworth into custody, the inspector's hands firm yet cautious, while the rest of the household breathed a tentative sigh of relief. Mrs. Whitby's shoulders relaxed, Jameson exhaled deeply, and Miss Hargrove finally allowed herself a small, trembling smile. The tension that had held the manor in a vice for days began to dissipate, replaced by a tentative calm. Miss Marple, seated once more in her favourite chair, allowed herself a moment of reflection. The final confrontation had not required force or grand gestures. It had required patience, observation, and understanding, the ability to see the subtle psychological threads woven through action, perception, and behaviour. Ellsworth's compulsion, his need to control and manipulate, had driven him to extremes, yet it had also left the most delicate traces, perceptible only to a mind attuned to human nature. As the night settled over Greystone Manor, the detective allowed herself a faint smile. The pattern had been revealed, the motive understood, and the criminal exposed. The orchestration of chaos, the vanishing evidence, the attacks, and the subtle manipulations, all had led to this moment of clarity. Justice, tempered with insight, had prevailed, and the household, though shaken, could finally begin to heal. Miss Marple rose and opened the window, letting the cool night air sweep through the room. The manor, still shadowed and quiet, seemed almost to exhale, releasing the tension that had held it captive. The game was complete, the threads of deception unravelled, and the truth, once hidden in plain sight, had emerged fully. She knew that the lessons of human behaviour, of compulsion and subtlety, would remain vivid, not just in this household, but in the mind of the detective who had patiently observed and understood what others had missed. The manor had settled into an uneasy calm. Ellsworth had been taken into custody, his confession still reverberating in the halls, and the household moved cautiously back to routines that were now tinged with relief but shadowed by lingering fear. Miss Marple, seated in her favourite chair by the hearth, had begun her quiet review of the past day's events. Every pattern had been discerned, every subtle signal interpreted, and the psychological motives laid bare. It seemed for the moment that the case had reached its conclusion. Yet, as night deepened and the manor's corridors grew long and shadowed, Miss Marple's mind remained alert. There was an inkling, a whisper of unease she could not dismiss. Patterns, once meticulously reconstructed, began to reveal a subtle irregularity she had not noticed before, a tiny discrepancy in timing, a subtle divergence in reactions that had seemed insignificant until now. Ellsworth had confessed, yes, but the manner in which certain events unfolded suggested the possibility of orchestration beyond a single individual. A hand guided from the shadows, one who had remained unnoticed, patiently allowing Ellsworth to take the stage while subtly manipulating events behind the curtain. She rose and began pacing slowly, revisiting every scene, every object, and every conversation. The floral scent, the ledger, the missing note, the attacks, each had been attributed to Ellsworth, yet some details resisted neat explanation. The perfume had been present even in moments when Ellsworth could not have applied it himself. Small behavioral cues, subtle gestures from other household members, hinted at awareness or complicity that had been overlooked. The possibility of a secondary orchestrator, someone who had remained in plain sight, now emerged as a shadow across the clarity she had achieved. Miss Marple decided to investigate immediately, returning to the drawing room where the household still lingered, tense but relieved. Browning had retired to his quarters, satisfied that the case was resolved. Ellsworth had been secured under guard, muttering broken explanations to himself. Mrs. Whitby sat quietly, knitting as though to restore order to her mind, while Jameson moved with measured care, still recovering from the attack. Miss Hargrove hovered near the doorway, her pale face betraying lingering apprehension. Miss Marple's eyes scanned them all carefully, noting subtleties she had overlooked during the prior confrontations. Fleeting glances, micro-expressions, and tiny inconsistencies that suggested a hidden hand. "Something still lingers," she murmured, mostly to herself. Ellsworth's compulsion was the motive we understood, yet the orchestration of events suggests an additional presence. She walked deliberately among the staff, speaking softly to elicit small reactions. The floral scent, for instance, it has appeared at times when Ellsworth could not have employed it. Some actions have seemed guided by a mind both patient and observant, a mind separate from the one whose confession we hold. Miss Hargrove shifted uneasily, her eyes flickering toward Mrs. Whitby. A subtle exchange passed between them, almost imperceptible, yet enough to catch Miss Marple's attention. Her suspicions sharpened. She needed to provoke a subtle reveal, a minor but telling reaction that could confirm or dismiss the presence of a hidden orchestrator. She introduced small inconsistencies, casually misaligning a chair, mentioning the vanished note, and hinting at observations that did not align neatly with Ellsworth's actions. Each provocation was carefully designed to elicit a subconscious signal. At first, nothing overt happened. Mrs. Whitby's knitting continued, Jameson's posture remained relaxed, and Miss Hargrove appeared tentative but composed. Then a faint tremor passed through Mrs. Whitby's hand as she reached for her teacup. Miss Marple observed the subtle glance Miss Hargrove cast toward her, a hesitation, a pause that betrayed awareness. It was a micro-reaction, almost imperceptible, yet it spoke volumes. Someone had been guiding events, allowing Ellsworth to take credit while carefully manipulating circumstances from the periphery. "Mrs. Whitby," Miss Marple said gently, her voice smooth and patient, "there are elements of these events that Ellsworth could not have managed alone. Certain details, small as they are, suggest the hand of someone who has understood and influenced each act. Would you care to explain?" Mrs. Whitby's fingers stilled, the knitting dropping slightly from her hands. Her face, previously composed, betrayed a flicker of alarm. I only meant to assist, to protect the household," she whispered. Her words were hesitant, defensive, and laden with a subtle plea for understanding. Miss Marple noted the careful construction of her speech, the blend of truth and concealment. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, the puzzle crystallizing in her mind. Mrs. Whitby had been the shadow orchestrator all along, the guiding hand that shaped events from behind the scenes. She had allowed Ellsworth to act out his compulsions, to become the visible culprit, while she subtly steered perceptions, manipulated small details, and controlled the environment to achieve a larger psychological goal. Her motive had been protective, perhaps born from years of loyalty or a desire to shield the household from a perceived threat, but it had required extreme measures, including careful orchestration of deception, misdirection, and even violence. Ellsworth's confession, while genuine, had been part of a broader design, one that Mrs. Whitby had subtly reinforced and exploited. The attacks, the floral signals, the stolen note, all had been manipulated to maintain the illusion of Ellsworth's sole culpability, ensuring that attention remained fixed where she intended. Even Jameson's minor reactions and Miss Hargrove's anxiety had been tools, pieces in a carefully constructed tableau of control. Miss Marple's voice, calm yet firm, carried across the room. The orchestration has been far more complex than we initially believed. Ellsworth's compulsion has been exploited, guided, and amplified by a second mind, one who has operated in the shadows while allowing the primary suspect to bear visible responsibility. Mrs. Whitby, your careful attention to detail, your subtle manipulation of events, and your psychological control over the household have made you the true architect behind these crimes. Mrs. Whitby's composure broke at last. She sank into her chair, tears welling in her eyes. I only wanted to protect the household," she whispered, voice trembling. "Ellsworth, he was unstable, obsessed. I thought if I guided him, controlled the events, it would prevent greater harm. I never intended." Her voice faltered, the confession spilling out as years of hidden compulsion and secrecy poured forth. Miss Marple nodded, noting the genuine mixture of fear, remorse, and protective intent. "Your actions, while extreme, have now been revealed. The pattern, the psychological manipulation, and the subtleties that maintained your influence have exposed the true course of events. Ellsworth's compulsion was the visible threat. Yours was the guiding hand. Understanding this allows us to see the full truth of the matter." Browning, alerted by the sudden revelation, entered the room and listened carefully. The inspector's eyes widened as Miss Marple explained the secondary orchestration, the hidden motives, and the dual-layered manipulation. Ellsworth's presence remained central, but it was now clear that the criminal landscape had been far more intricate than initially imagined. The household, shocked yet relieved, absorbed the truth. The tension of recent days gave way to a complex mixture of emotions: relief that the true pattern had been uncovered, sorrow for the depths of obsession and fear that had shaped the actions, and a tentative understanding that human motives could be layered, subtle, and profoundly personal. Miss Marple allowed herself a brief moment of quiet satisfaction. The last-minute twist had tested every skill she possessed, every observation and insight accumulated over the investigation. The criminal mind had proven cunning, patient, and multi-layered, but careful observation, patience, and understanding had unravelled the final secret. Justice, guided by perception and comprehension, had prevailed. As the night settled fully over Greystone Manor, the detective stood by the window, gazing at the moonlight reflecting off the grounds. The house, now free of the shadows that had manipulated it, seemed to breathe at last. The true complexity of human behaviour had been revealed, the hidden motives exposed, and the case finally fully brought to light. Miss Marple's keen mind, tested to its utmost, had discerned the final truth. The orchestration of chaos had always been twofold, visible and invisible, and it had taken every ounce of her insight to unravel both threads. The last-minute twist, shocking as it was, only confirmed the depth of her understanding, leaving her with the quiet satisfaction of a mystery completely solved. The first light of dawn spilled through the tall windows of Greystone Manor, casting a pale glow across the once tense drawing room. The previous night's revelations had left the household shaken, yet there was a fragile sense of order. Ellsworth remained in custody, his compulsions now exposed, while Mrs. Whitby, the hidden architect of the events, sat quietly in a corner, her expression a mixture of fear, resignation, and reluctant relief. Miss Marple, calm as ever, observed the room with her characteristic patience, understanding that the final resolution required not only exposure but explanation, closure, and careful orchestration of justice. Browning, ever eager to enforce the law, had been briefed on the dual-layered manipulation, the visible compulsion of Ellsworth, and the hidden orchestration by Mrs. Whitby. The inspector's eyebrows knitted in concentration as Miss Marple recounted her deductions, linking every subtle clue, every psychological signal, and every piece of evidence to the conclusions she had drawn. "It's remarkable," Browning muttered, "how these details were right in front of us all along, yet we missed them." Miss Marple allowed a faint smile. Attention to human behaviour, she knew, was as crucial as the tangible traces of crime. She began to explain, her voice measured yet precise. The floral scent, first noticed during the initial incidents, was never random. Its presence marked moments of orchestration, not only by Ellsworth but by Mrs. Whitby, who used it as a signature to guide perception subtly. The vanished note, the rearranged objects, the minor inconsistencies in timing, all were intentionally constructed to mislead, to focus suspicion on Ellsworth while maintaining the invisible hand of control. Observing these details required patience, understanding, and attention to both action and reaction. Ellsworth, still pale and shaken, muttered defensively, I did everything myself. I didn't need anyone's help." His voice carried the familiar undertone of compulsion, yet Miss Marple knew the truth was layered. She addressed him gently. "You acted under your own compulsions, yes, but some events were orchestrated to amplify and guide those actions. Mrs. Whitby, in her care and attention to detail, allowed the illusion of your sole culpability to persist while subtly manipulating circumstances." Mrs. Whitby's lips trembled. "I only wanted to protect the household," she whispered. "I never thought it would go this far. I didn't intend anyone to be harmed." Her confession was halting, but it revealed the dangerous duality of intent, protective yet manipulative to the extreme, crossing moral and legal boundaries. Miss Marple's eyes softened momentarily, acknowledging the complexity of human motives, but she remained firm. Intent alone does not absolve the consequences. The orchestration, while protective in your mind, led to fear, harm, and chaos. Justice must account for both action and effect. Browning nodded, appreciating the clarity Miss Marple provided. "So, the true criminal landscape," he said, "was never just one person. It was a layered interplay. Ellsworth's compulsion made him the visible threat, but Mrs. Whitby's guidance and orchestration were the hidden force that shaped events." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Exactly. The duality is what made the case so challenging. Observing the subtleties, micro-reactions, timing discrepancies, the strategic use of scent and objects, revealed the full truth." She gestured toward the mantel where the vial of perfume remained, a silent symbol of the subtle psychological signature that had been overlooked by everyone but the most observant. "Notice," she said, "the scent was used deliberately, a marker guiding perception and eliciting reactions. The criminal relied on human behavior, memory and response as instruments. Those who failed to observe the subtleties missed the orchestration entirely." The household, though subdued, seemed to grasp the gravity of the revelations. Jameson, who had maintained his quiet, analytical composure throughout, finally spoke. "It's incredible how much of this was psychological. The acts themselves, the evidence, it's almost secondary to how perception was manipulated." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. Often, the most dangerous manipulation occurs in the mind rather than through direct action. The criminal's success depended on exploiting assumptions, expectation, and human oversight. Understanding that requires both observation and insight." Ellsworth remained silent, absorbed in the realization of his role within the larger scheme. Mrs. Whitby, despite her confessed orchestration, was quietly aware that justice would not be lenient. The law would account for her role in guiding, amplifying, and manipulating Ellsworth's actions, despite the protective intentions she claimed. Miss Marple observed both of them with the detachment of one who understands human nature in all its complexity. Browning finally addressed the household, his tone careful but firm. "Justice will be served, though its form may differ for each individual. Ellsworth's compulsions and actions must be accounted for, and Mrs. Whitby's orchestration, while perhaps motivated by care, cannot excuse the fear and harm caused. The courts will weigh these factors, but the law cannot ignore manipulation and intent, Miss Marple added, and yet the lesson here extends beyond the courtroom. Observation, patience, and understanding are the tools that reveal truth. The hidden clues, misplaced objects, subtle gestures, even the faintest scent, were all there for those attentive enough to perceive them. The case demonstrates that human behavior, with all its complexity and subtlety, is often the key to uncovering both motive and orchestration. As the morning light grew brighter, a quiet resolution settled over Greystone Manor. The criminal roles had been exposed, the psychological motives revealed, and justice prepared to act. Yet even in the clarity, there lingered a subtle unease, a reminder that human nature is rarely straightforward. Protective intent can lead to manipulation, obsession can justify extremity, and even careful observation must contend with hidden depths. Miss Marple walked slowly to the window, gazing at the dew-fresh grounds. The manor, though scarred by events, seemed poised to recover, yet she knew that the lessons of observation and insight would endure long after the formal resolution. She had traced patterns, discerned subtle signals, and understood motives invisible to others. The case, though resolved in terms of law and exposure, left a lingering awareness of human complexity that could never be fully contained. Browning, satisfied with the outcome but still processing the layers revealed, placed a reassuring hand on Miss Marple's shoulder. "Your insight has been remarkable, as always," he said. "I don't know that anyone else could have pieced together what you have." Miss Marple inclined her head politely. "Observation and patience reveal what is hidden, Inspector. Often the clues are not missing. They are merely subtle, awaiting the eye trained to see." Mrs. Whitby's quiet acceptance of her fate, Ellsworth's subdued remorse, and the household's tentative return to routine underscored the delicate balance of justice. Law, perception, and morality intersected here, yet Miss Marple understood that true resolution required more than punishment. It required comprehension, reflection, and the unravelling of the hidden threads that had guided every action. As she stepped into the corridor, Miss Marple allowed herself a final thought, almost a whisper to the quiet manor. The mystery was solved, the patterns revealed, and justice ready to act. Yet the awareness of human subtlety, of hidden motives and the shadows that guide actions, remained with her. Greystone Manor would recover, but the case had imparted an enduring lesson. In the world of human behaviour, perception is as crucial as evidence, and the keen observer is always one step ahead. The household exhaled collectively, a mixture of relief and lingering apprehension, as Miss Marple finally took her seat by the hearth. The light of morning streamed in fully, illuminating not only the room but the depth of human complexity that had been revealed. Justice, in all its forms, legal, moral, and psychological, had been addressed, yet the quiet awareness of subtle manipulation lingered like a faint scent, reminding all that in the shadows of human nature, nothing is ever entirely simple. The morning sun poured fully into the halls of Greystone Manor, casting a warm glow over the still recovering household. Though the main players had been identified, apprehended, and confronted, Miss Marple sensed that the story was not entirely complete. The events had been untangled, motives revealed, and justice set into motion, yet a subtle unease lingered in the air, a faint echo of something unresolved. Even as the household moved to reclaim a sense of ordinary routine, she felt the lingering shadow of human complexity, the subtle, unpredictable threads that always hinted at more beneath the surface. Miss Marple walked slowly through the corridors, her cane tapping lightly against the polished floor. She paused at each doorway, noting the small signs of life. Mrs. Whitby quietly arranging the dining table, Jameson checking the stables, and Miss Hargrove cautiously opening shutters to let in fresh air. Everything appeared orderly, yet her sharp eyes caught a small irregularity, a letter resting at an unusual angle atop the library desk, partially obscured beneath a pile of correspondence. It had not been there when she last inspected the room, or so she thought. The paper bore no envelope. It was an old, slightly yellowed note, written in a delicate, almost cryptic hand. Curious, she bent to examine it more closely. The message was brief, almost an afterthought, yet its phrasing was enigmatic. The game is not over. The shadows move where you do not look. Miss Marple felt a familiar tingle of intrigue. It was not a threat, not exactly, but a subtle reminder that in human affairs, even the most carefully revealed truths might conceal other layers. She considered the possibilities. A final message from a confederate of Mrs. Whitby or Ellsworth, a lingering admirer of their manipulations, or perhaps a minor actor in the previous events who had gone unnoticed. Whatever its origin, the note was a whisper of the wider, unresolved complexity of the world around her. She pocketed the note, moving onward with the quiet, deliberate composure that had characterized her throughout the investigation. In the sunlight, the manor seemed peaceful, yet she knew better than to assume that order reflected true resolution. People's motivations are rarely linear. Secrets persist in corners, hidden in gestures, memories and subtleties that escape the casual eye. The previous weeks had proven that a single, careful observer could unravel layers of deception, yet the very nature of human behavior ensured that new patterns would always emerge. Walking toward the front entrance, Miss Marple paused by the window overlooking the manicured gardens. The morning breeze carried the scent of early blooms, mingling faintly with the residual fragrance of the floral perfume that had signaled the earlier manipulations. She smiled faintly to herself. Even in resolution, the smallest of details, a scent, a glance, a subtle hesitation, held power, capable of revealing what was otherwise invisible. The note had reminded her that vigilance was never truly complete. Even when one layer of a mystery is peeled away, another may lie beneath, waiting patiently for discovery. As she descended the staircase, she reflected on the household. Mrs. Whitby, though exposed and preparing to answer for her role in the manipulation, still retained an air of dignity and protective intent. Ellsworth, restrained and subdued, was aware of the broader implications of his compulsions, and yet remained a figure whose inner life was partially veiled, leaving room for reflection and judgment. The servants, the minor observers, all retained subtle traces of the events, awareness, fear, curiosity, that might resurface in unexpected ways. Human behavior, she knew, is never truly static. It evolves, reacts, and sometimes conceals more than it reveals. At the doorway, she paused to glance once more over the grand hall, noting the interplay of shadow and light, the lingering aura of tension now mixed with cautious relief. Browning, satisfied that the immediate danger had passed, had begun finalizing reports, yet even he had cast uneasy glances at corners of the room, unconsciously aware that the resolution was orderly but not absolute. Miss Marple understood perfectly. Justice, while enacted, does not always equate to total clarity or finality. There were always margins of ambiguity, spaces where human intent, error, or design might continue to ripple through the narrative. The note's cryptic message lingered in her thoughts as she stepped outside into the fresh air. She inhaled deeply, the gardens stretching before her like a stage where invisible actors might still play unseen roles. She allowed herself a private smile, a recognition that mystery is a perpetual companion, never fully concluded. The world is layered, human motives are tangled, and there is always the possibility that the threads she thought she had traced could extend into unseen realms. Even as she hailed a waiting carriage to return to her quiet home, Miss Marple felt the thrill of anticipation. Though this chapter had ended, the subtle intricacies of human behavior and hidden motives ensured that another challenge, another puzzle, would arise. Perhaps a misplaced object in a distant manor, a whisper of deceit, or a minor detail dismissed by ordinary observers would beckon her attention. She was content in knowing that her skills, her observation, patience, and comprehension of human nature would always be required, always ready for the next enigma. As the carriage wheels turned along the winding road away from Greystone Manor, the manor itself receded into the distance, sunlit yet shadowed by the invisible imprints of recent events. The household, now safe yet quietly aware, would carry forward, tempered by the lessons of deceit, manipulation, and the subtlety of human intent. Miss Marple, in her seat, contemplated the cryptic note, the unresolved shadows, and the fact that the end of one mystery is merely the beginning of another. She allowed her mind a final, meditative reflection. The smallest details, an unusual glance, a faint scent, a cryptic message, can carry weight far beyond their apparent significance. They are the keys to understanding human behavior, to perceiving hidden motives, and to unraveling the layers of truth that lie beneath everyday appearances. Even as one story concludes, another begins, quietly, patiently, waiting for the eye trained to observe what others cannot. By the time the carriage disappeared from view, the manor lay bathed in light, peaceful yet subtly restless. Miss Marple's figure receded along the road, a quiet reminder that wherever human behavior conceals complexity, subtle observation and patient reasoning remain indispensable. The case at Greystone Manor had been solved, yes, but the final whisper of mystery, the note, the lingering shadows, remained, ensuring that curiosity, vigilance, and the pursuit of truth would continue. One step ahead, as always, Miss Marple smiled to herself, prepared for the enigmas yet to come, for the eternal dance between perception and secrecy that defines the heart of every true mystery.